across the Indian Ocean, on both sides of the Indian Ocean, as it were. I also isolated the debates and positions of a scholar who is readily identifiable in the context of postcolonial discourse. And of course, this is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We all have heard about him one way or the other, whether it is through his linguistic activism or language activism, or whether it is through literary theory and postcolonial studies, or whether it is through the debates about the third world and questions to do with economic and social justice, which have cost him his life in terms of his academic life. And today, although he has roots in Kenya, here in Nairobi where I am, he lives in University of California at Irvine in the US, and he has been living out of Kenya, out of Africa, since 1982, when he went into forced exile because of the ideologies of that time. The repressive nature of African politics in the 70s and 80s is well documented, and this set an exodus of African intelligentsia from Kenya to Nigeria and further beyond out of the continent. They call it brain drain in economic terms, but in the sphere of language, literature, and culture, we think of it as exile, you know, forced exile or voluntary exile, and so on and so forth. And Ngugi is a beneficiary of this. The warped nature of justice and retribution in the context of postcoloniality, of course, created an environment that was not sustaining and sustainable for the practice of expressive cultures, literature included, whenever they were found to speak truth and speak truth to power. Those who spoke such truth, be it in literature or otherwise, were forced either into detention, into incarceration. Others were, of course, paid with their lives. People like Ken Saro-Wiwa of Nigeria, etc. And others, of course, like Ngugi, were forced out of the continent by that constrictive space that managed to emerge after independence at the hand of in the hands of the political class. So using Ngugi, therefore, is a legitimate starting point of a discussion like this one, and is elements of thought revolving around language, postcoloniality, and the greater quest for cultural decolonization is what is the larger framework in which my sharing today is positioned. So I call my presentation Positionalities in Renegotiating the Pedagogy and Praxis of Postcolonialities. The case of literary languages in Kenya. You may be aware or not that just the other day, at the beginning of this month, in September 3rd, the breakaway or secessionist part of Spain called Catalonia decided to give Ngugi wa Thiong'o the 31st Catalonia International Prize, which is also known as Premi Internacional Catalunya, which is a prize they give to different people for advancing social justice using a cornucopia of different ways, from literature to philosophy, political activism to gender activism, environmental activism, etc. So some of the previous recipients of these Catalonian International Prize given by the Catalonia government, which is trying to break away from mainland Spain. Some of the earlier recipients include Bishop Desmond Tutu, who is well versed and well known for his work in the dismantling of apartheid, hand in hand with Mandela and others in South Africa. Other activists who have bagged this prize include Malala Yousafzai. We all know Malala, and we know what she stands for as an icon of our moment in time. Another one is someone like the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. We have read his works and we are familiar with what he stands for. And others include the Egyptian feminist Nawal al-Saadawi, who has also been a political prisoner because of her writing and activism in Egypt for many years. We are familiar with her literary works, including God Dies by the Nile, Women at Point Zero, and so on and so forth. Another one, of course, a rare one here, is the political economist Karl Popper, the philosopher, who has also been given this prize by the government of Catalan. So Ngugi becomes the recent most awardee of this prize, and this raised quite a furore in Kenya when Ngugi wa Thiong'o decided to give his acceptance speech on the 3rd of this month in a night or rather evening of a Thursday out there in Catalonia. He decided to give his acceptance speech in Gikuyu. And this, of course, opened a whole can of worms insofar as language, postcoloniality, and cultural expression is concerned. Two different positions quickly emerged in the wake of his speech. One, which is identified here in Kenya by the University of Nairobi, Professor Henry Ndagasi, argued that he should not have given the speech in Gikuyu because the speech was being awarded at an international level. It would have been better for him to use an international language, because the old debate about English being a colonial language has now been, is now water under the bridge. There is the other new discourse that English is not just a colonial language or an imperial language of expression at one point, especially in the 20th and 19th century. In the 21st century, it is playing a huge role as a global lingua franca. So he should have accepted the prize in English. In any case, English is not just a European language, it is the national and official language of Kenya. We use it as a language of trade, we use it as a language of politics, we use it as a language of education, and of course, this is not any different from the other Commonwealth countries. So Professor Ndagasi from University of Nairobi, who is himself a student of Ngugi in the early 70s, claimed that his teacher should have spoken in English, because speaking in Gikuyu to an audience which was not understanding what he was saying was like beating a dead horse. He has his own school which believes to that particular position that Ndagasi took in favor of English as a medium of expression in Africa today in the 21st century. And of course, there was the counter discourse, which also is represented by Dr. Enoch Matundura of Chuka University here in Kenya. Dr. Matundura's position was that Ngugi should not have spoken in English and he should not have accepted the speech in Gikuyu. Rather, he should have accepted the prize using the common African language that is being championed by the African Union as the lingua franca for the entire continent of 55 countries. And this language is Kiswahili, a language which plays the same role as Bengali does in Northeast India, or as Gujarat does maybe in Mumbai environs, or as Kannada does in southern India. Languages which play regional functions in an area of linguistic multiplicity. In a polyvalent region like India, there are certain languages which stand above others in terms of function for purposes of inter- and intra-regional communication. And here in East Africa, the language that plays this role is Kiswahili. It is a language today which is spoken by around 100 million East Africans, and it is growing. Just the other day, the Parliament of Botswana passed a law that Kiswahili will be introduced to Botswana in the near future. And of course, Botswana is a Southern African country. It is not in East Africa. South Sudan, which is a breakaway republic from the larger Sudan, which got independence from Britain, South Sudan today is introducing Kiswahili into its schools as a language of East Africa, a language of intra-regional communication. Kiswahili is the only African language which African Union accepts as a language of operation in Addis Ababa, where the headquarters is. So in Addis Ababa, a president or a head of state can use English or French or Arabic or Portuguese, but the only African language that is permitted to be used for intercontinental or rather intra-country and interstate and continental communication is Kiswahili. So Dr. Matundura felt that Ngugi should have spoken in an African language, but he should have spoken in the language of the continent, the language that speaks for the spirit of the continent and the aspiration of the continent's future. That is the language called Kiswahili, which of course Ngugi understands and also speaks. By speaking Gikuyu, he limited himself to a certain constituency of L1 speakers or mother tongue speakers who speak this language, yet they make just an iota of the population in East Africa, and it is a language, Gikuyu is a language which is not readily available in terms of understanding and in terms of being decoded by the rest of East Africans. So here you have Professor Ndagasi upholding the vitality of English as a post-colonial language in East African cultural spaces. And on the other hand, you have Matundura upholding the importance of the lingua franca, the continental lingua franca, in addressing African cultural points or African cultural celebrations, such as acceptance of an international award. And of course, Ngugi himself holding on to a third position that the mother tongues of Africa, the mother tongues of the world, all the native languages of the world are equal competitors for speech and articulation at all levels of iteration. And because of that, of course, now we have these three different positions, whether we are to use the native languages of Africa to envision our post-coloniality, or use the former colonial language, or use the lingua franca, which is being championed by different countries. Now, let me quickly bring this matter home to the literature situation. In a country like Kenya, which has 2 national languages and 2 official languages, English and Kiswahili, and about 44 different ethnic or tribal languages, the bigger question becomes, which language can we use to create literature for the future of our post-colony called Kenya? And which languages can we therefore pass rafts of laws, policies, and laws and policies which support their linguistic health? Should we support the languages which are native to Kenya, which are around 44 of them? Should we support Kiswahili, which is the lingua franca? Or should we support English because of its vitality as an international language of communication? So what should we do? And the literary implication of this choice is such that we need to know which languages then should be used for literary creation of texts, and which languages should we use for the teaching of literature. So when we talk about praxis, for example, we are thinking about literature in practice. We are thinking about the teaching of literature in schools. So should we teach African literatures here in Kenya in English, or should we teach African literatures in Kenya in Kiswahili, or should we teach African literatures here in Kenya in mother tongues or in the vernacular languages of orality? So what should we do then? Then we find ourselves, therefore, in a dilemma. We find ourselves at a crossroad, both as practitioners, that is the novelists, writers, poets, etc., as well as the pedagogists, including myself. People who derive a salary or people who derive a career raison d'etre or reason for existence through the perpetuation of teaching of literatures of the post-colonial societies. So we find ourselves really at a crossroad. And the best way for me, if I am to also put in my personal position, is to spearhead the entrenchment of translation studies in post-colonial spaces. In India, this is a foregone debate. It's a debate that India started quite early. It's a debate that is vibrant. We are aware, for example, of the good work that is being done by the translation scholars at JNU, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We are thinking of people like Dwivedi, Vachaspati Dwivedi. We are thinking of people such as, I forget his name, the professor who translated Ngugi into Hindi in JNU, etc. So in India, this is a debate that already exists, and it's a debate that is foregone. But here in Africa, in a place like Kenya, we are yet to embrace translation studies for the vitality that it has and the vitality that it can give us in terms of the ways forward. So if we are going to find a middle ground for the existence of all these tripartite linguistic categories, then the vernacular, the lingua franca, and the international medium, and each one of them, in terms of literary production, be appreciated for the great work that it is doing in terms of creating world literatures today, we need then to embrace translation studies. And this is something that we need to do because others in other spaces in the South have done it, and it has brought fruits in their own contexts and in their own backgrounds. So the quest for South to South dialogues needs to be reoriented on the linguistic point, so that we need to, so that we have bridges of best practices that can be learned from South to South by writers and pedagogists of the South, the better to be able to address the various and multiple concerns at the cultural, social, and even political level. So for those of us who are here in Kenya, the debate has been reopened anew. When he stopped writing in Gikuyu in 1977, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's last novel in English, Petals of Blood, became a kind of signpost for the linguistic debate that started in 1962 in Makerere, with African writers such as Achebe and others asking themselves which language should best be used to articulate postcoloniality at the literary level. And of course, there are those who felt that the colonial languages should be retained, and there are those who also felt that articulating literature in Africa using colonial language was still pandering up to that jingoistic position of the imperial past. So they felt then that decolonization of culture should, of essence and ipso facto, be an agenda that is articulated using the languages of the continent that are as old as the continent itself, as native as the continent itself, and as true as the populations that as true as the population for which these writers purport to speak, and as true as the populations which stand as the cultural constituency from where these writers from Achebe to Ngugi meet the rest of the world. So in conclusion, I would say then that in the South-South debate, in the South-South dialogue, questions to do with the language should not just be articulated in terms of archipelagos, India and Asia articulating its own concerns, Africa articulating its own concerns, Latin America and the Caribbean articulating its own concerns. No, we should not work as archipelagos of postcolonialities. Rather, we should work as an orchestra of postcolonialities, whereby the best practices of each space in the South is embraced and adapted and adopted, the better to help others who are in the global South to meet and rise to the occasion when faced with challenges that are unique to the global South. And these challenges cut across from Asia or South Asia to East Africa to the Caribbean region. All these post-colonial concerns are well known, well documented, and ubiquitously similar. So we do not have to invent the wheel here when it comes to translation studies and language issues insofar as literary cultures of post-colonial societies is concerned. What we need to do is to engage India more, find bridgeways or pathways of collaborations, institutional, individual, and associational, and instigate this debate. With the in the wake of the corona pandemic, space and time has been compressed into virtual communication. Today, I sit here in my office in Nairobi, and I'm able to participate in this intercontinental conversation. So this is a silver lining in a dark cloud that we should all seize. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me from this side of the Indian Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice. It was really wonderful listening to you. And you tie up a lot of very interesting points that were raised yesterday by Dr. Israel, who talked about translation as a tool, as a methodological tool that we could possibly use to enter these pluriform knowledge practices, or we could engage in pluriform knowledge practices. And so you have brought in a very interesting perspective. You've brought in the African context, and you've talked about how they can be, we can also use these various languages and the politics that goes with the interaction of these various languages, and translation as a tool that would mediate these conversations. And in some sense, it would also fracture a homogenized idea or homogenized perception of Africa, or individual, even individual national literary practices, as you have just highlighted. And that ties up very well with actually the next lecture that we are going to listen to. Dr. Rajiva is going to talk about the possibility of a Sri Lankan literary canon, and I'm sure that he will take up some of these debates that you've already introduced in the Sri Lankan context. Over to you, Dr. Vijay Sinha.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Justice, for that sharp introduction, which I think may give some sort of background to what I'm going to say now. I hope I'm not being simplistic in assuming that perhaps one of the main purposes of this admirable initiative on your part is to encourage greater reading, not just knowledge, but reading of texts from other southern countries in our different southern countries. But of course, such reading also needs to be accompanied by understanding. And therefore, to put it rather crudely, one needs to perhaps attract the attention of scholars who might be willing to take on some responsibility in this respect and develop greater interest in the fellow literatures of the South. Now, in this respect, I think Sri Lanka has perhaps suffered a comparative disadvantage because, in a sense, our Sri Lankan writing is not perhaps as well known internationally as is the work of several other, for want of a better word, let me say, Commonwealth countries, to use that old term, Commonwealth literature studies. But there are clearly some established African writers and also some very established Indian writers. And the same goes for some of the great writers of South America. But Sri Lankans are hardly known. Now, of course, this may have to do with Sri Lanka being a much smaller country. And it may also have to do with the very complicated situation we have of, in a sense, three languages in fairly common use in Sri Lanka. Sinhalese is the language of the majority, but it's only spoken in Sri Lanka. So let us say there may be up to 15 million people who function in Sinhala. Then you have Tamil, which is spoken by maybe a quarter of that number. But of course, there's a much larger Tamil audience in India itself and indeed internationally. So there is scope for greater awareness of Tamil literature. Though I did find that, except in a few cases, very few Tamil writers are generally accepted as universally readable. And sometimes there's a slight difference in the Tamil that's used. But it's also all supposed to do with the fact that the center of Tamil literature very distinguished writers, and there's no one to, as it were, push the cause of the others. And then the third language is English. And we didn't really develop an English language literature as early as, say, you did in India. But then we had this terrible drawback that the entire academic establishment sat very firmly on writers in English and sort of said they were not worth reading. And for about 20 or 30 years, there was this prevalent wisdom that you really shouldn't write in English. It was anti-national, it was because you couldn't write in Sinhala Tamil. And this was accompanied rather ironically by the most conservative university in Colombo University, in Sri Lanka, Colombo University, actually attacking one of our best writers for being ungrammatical, not writing the Queen's English. You may not be aware that Sri Lankans actually think they speak the best English in the world and liken ourselves to Shakespeare and think everyone else has a rather peculiar accent and our English is perfect. And of course, when England abandoned received pronunciation, Sri Lanka kept on at it. And in fact, that has rather vitiated English studies because many people who pronounce on the basis of their own language, whether Sinhala or Tamil, tend to be looked down on. So we really had a great struggle in the 80s to try to develop A, acceptance of writing in English, and B, spreading the use of English more widely, which of course, as we know, is essential in the modern world, because we don't have, for Sinhalese, the numbers that would actually make it viable. Now, this, of course, leads to the question that also came up of translation. How do you get the work of Sri Lankan writers to be read, not only internationally, but even within Sri Lanka itself? Because we had a very peculiar political dispensation from the 40s, when a rather nasty politician insisted that all children be straitjacketed in their own languages, except for the elite. The elite continued to have English, but the Sinhalese had to learn in Sinhala compulsorily, and the Tamils had to learn in Tamil compulsorily. And no one bothered then, no one bothers now to make even a second language compulsory. There are bleatings about how it's desirable to know 2 languages or even 3, but it's impossible to get politicians to make the decision to make this compulsory, any one of the other 2. So, you know, if you learn in Sinhala medium, you should learn English or Tamil, in Tamil English or Sinhala, and in English medium Sinhala or Tamil. So we are, in a sense, isolated from each other, and we haven't been able to create a sense of a unified Sri Lankan literature, even though, and I think this is one of the most important things, that the writers themselves are generally much more sensitive to the needs, the aspirations, the sufferings of the other communities. As you're probably well aware, Sri Lanka had a rather awful civil war with a lot of internecine fighting. But a lot of the literature, while of course, making clear the suffering that communities went through, also contains a lot of empathy. And this is why I'm very glad, although it took India to do it, the National Book Trust of India published for me over the last 5 years 2 anthologies of English, Sinhala and Tamil writing from Sri Lanka, all translated into English, of course, which took some time. I had to actually, look very carefully to find good translations of the Sinhala and Tamil writing. The Tamil was easier because they had a bigger audience. But ultimately, the product that emerged was really, I think, a very fine account of general Sri Lankan thinking. But of course, the tragedy is that Sri Lankan academics are not interested. Sri Lankan academics tend to push their own interests. I remember when I first started to suggest that we ought to do more Sri Lankan writing, the educational establishment was headed by a gentleman who thought you shouldn't really study anything except classic English literature. And the anthology prescribed for advanced level began with a poem by a chap called Thomas Lodge, whom my English friends hadn't heard of. I think in post-colonial societies that he tends to be better known. It's all about, she has a garden in her face, cherries ripe and red and that sort of thing. And this was what our students meant to read. So no wonder they seemed to think that English was a very alien language. And then when we tried to push the idea of Commonwealth literature, Colombo, for instance, had one course simply because one of its lecturers had got a PhD in African drama. So they all learned about African drama. And there wasn't really anything of Sri Lankan writing on these curricula. And that still tends to be the case. It's a bit better now. But I think you have to begin in, let us say, trying to establish a canon by getting people together to sort of recognize what is good, to having more critical writing about Sri Lankan writers, whether in Sinhala or Tamil or English. And this has simply been lacking in our academia. Now, one problem we have, of course, is that obviously Sri Lankan writers who live abroad tend to be published more readily. Unlike India, we don't really have a very good publishing industry. And of course, they're more fashionable. Now, some of them are very good. And I think someone like Shyam Selvadurai, who captured something of the Sri Lankan crisis very effectively in his first book, is worth studying by us. But then there are others like Ramesh Gunasekara, who's very much an orientalizing writer. And there's a sense of, patronage in his account of the Sri Lankan situation. A bit like Leonard Woolf, whose novel, The Village in the Jungle, is celebrated the first Sri Lankan novel in English. And it really is an appalling account of how only the colonial master really understands the village, the peasants who are oppressed by the village headmen and the rich people and so on. Now, this particular problem has led really to a downplaying of Sri Lankan literature. And we weren't helped enough, I think, by the input of someone who I think is our best Sri Lankan Sinhala writer in the second part of the 20th century, Professor Sarachandra, who was better known as a dramatist, derived a lot of his inspiration from other aspects of Asian writing, Tagore, Japanese drama, and so on. But then, towards his latter days, he started writing in English for work that he felt was better expressed in that language. But none of that is really studied as much as it should be. And I think we really have to try to develop a sea change amongst our academics. And in one sense, it would help if perhaps there were also some greater awareness in India itself, where some of these writings are there, of the Sri Lankan writers. I do know that some Indian academics have asked me about some people whom Penguin India published. I think we have to be very grateful for Penguin for having picked up writers like Carl Muller or Yasmin Gunaratnam, who are really very good writers and worth reading. But what I would call the people who seem to encapsulate the social changes that have been so important in Sri Lanka, the political context of the last 20 years, which has been really very divisive in its impact on society. Those books are not really understood, except in the orientalizing form of, as I said, Ramesh Gunasekara, or indeed Michael Ondaatje, who's a lovely memoir about Sri Lanka, called Running in the Family. But then he ventured to talk about the Sri Lankan political context, produced another really rather unrealistic, exaggerated version. So I hope we can move towards a greater synthesizing, and I hope that this discussion is a start. Let me just end with one other point, I think, which is not strictly germane to my talk, but which I do worry about, how let's say the discourse about writing in our parts of the world is still dominated by the West. I'd just like to make a plea for someone whose centenary occurred this year, Paul Scott, who wrote the Raj Quartet, and that, which is a stunning indictment of the British colonial presence in India, has been anodized into a celebration of the wonderful colonials. And I'm really rather surprised that India hasn't done more this year to celebrate someone whose critique of the so-called good British, not the villains are obviously villains, but the people who claim to be working on behalf of India, how utterly hypocritical they were, and allowed the tragedies of the partition during Indian independence and the massacres. And I think in that respect too, we need to perhaps overcome the colonial heritage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vijay. And you've picked up, you've connected, I think, Africa to Sri Lanka very, very well. And you've taken over or connected some of the points that Justice raised about languages coming together, the problems of canonization, how do you prioritize, how do you hierarchize, what conversations takes place within English departments, most importantly, something that Justice pointed out and you pointed out, that how do we therefore, understand how we teach literatures and how we also contribute in the canon making process. And I think this leads us to the next lecture, Professor Bhattacharya. And, we discuss this very often. It's interesting to note that, the question of language that we talk about in India as to what kind of, the translation question that comes up again and again, what kind of literatures should we teach in India, should we teach, how much of translation should we teach, what kind of text should be accommodated, what should be left out, and how, in a certain sense, something that is very, very important to us as practitioners as to how do we do these university or academic spaces then continuously forge a canon, and how it's a continuous process. So this leads us to Professor Bhattacharya's talk. Professor Bhattacharya will be talking on after world literature, decolonizing literary studies. So it ties up very well with the two presentations that we had. So how are we going to, what is our, possibly Professor Bhattacharya is going to take us through how these processes, these machinations, or these orchestrations, as Justice pointed out, how do they play out in a so-called decolonized world? Over to you, Professor Bhattacharya.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Let me start by thanking the Departments of English of SNDTWU Women's University, Mumbai, and Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, University of Calcutta, for their, and of course to Drupadi, for their invitation to be part of this webinar. What I'll do in the next half an hour or so is I'll take you through a particular debate in literary departments across the world right now, which I think would be an interesting site to reimagine this kind of, South-South dialogue that we are all trying to think through. This is a debate about what is world literature and how do we conceptualize, how do we read, how do we teach world literature. Many of you will know this is a 19th century idea. The idea first emerged with two German speakers. First one is Goethe and the second one is Marx. The idea of Welt literature in German, or world literature, became a kind of catchphrase to understand contemporary literary productions. This is the first half of 19th century. In the last 2 decades or so, this idea has been revived as a conceptual grid, if you like, to understand globalization and literary production under globalization. So the idea or the argument is that world literature as a conceptual tool is better equipped to understand or deal with our globalized literary culture than any other available tools that we have been using so far, including, let's say, something like postcolonial studies and so on. So this argument has been proposed in 3 different forms, or which I often describe as the trinity of world literature, which is David Damrosch, Franco Moretti, and Pascal Casanova. In Damrosch's argument, before we go into individual points, we need to remember that all of them are suggesting that world literature is not or cannot be an empirical category. The argument is not that literatures of the entire world across centuries would constitute something like world literature. That would be an absurd thing, an impractical thing to think about or to teach. So all of them, all 3, Damrosch, Moretti, and Casanova, they have their individual formulations. In Damrosch's formulation, it's something like a text that circulates out of its original point or original culture of production, either in its own language or in translation. So for Damrosch, anything between, let's say, Divine Comedy up to the autobiography of Rigoberta Manchu, which are widely read beyond their point of origin, anything of this sort could become world literature. Right? Though the word has a 19th century origin, Damrosch is quite happy to go back to, say, something like the Epic of Gilgamesh as a representative case of world literature. In Moretti's case, Moretti argues it's a problem, it's a theoretical problem, it's not a descriptive category. It's a theoretical problem, and one has to engage with this question with the help of digital humanities, which is basically big data. One has to think of or identify certain patterns in the circulation of text, certain patterns in the emergence of genres and things like that, as a result of which he has very consciously proposed the idea of distant reading. Instead of close reading, which is the bread and butter for almost all of us who deal with literature, he's suggesting we need to develop something like distant reading, through which we'll be able to map something like world literature. For Casanova, it's a multinational market space, within which various nations with their individual respective national literatures, they're all vying for eyeballs, if you like. So this is roughly and very crudely the three major positions within the world literature debates. Now, after the first few years of almost uncritical celebration, then we have another phase where various critiques have emerged of this kind of idea of a world literature. Particularly important are Gayatri Spivak, Emily Apter, Feng Chia, Amir Mufti, Siraz Ahmed, and many others. I have also made a little contribution in this debate. What I'll do today, I'll actually describe a project which I think is important and would be important in our rethinking of the South-South dialogue in terms of literary studies, and particularly in the shadow or in the wake of world literature studies. This is about the idea of literature itself. What do we mean by literature? And what counts as literary in a given context or in a given cultural milieu? This is something which has remained largely unexamined. If you look at the world literature arguments, most of the ideas have tried to define the world part of world literature. What it means by literature has remained somewhat unexamined. So this is something I want to open up for our critical discussion. I'll start with a kind of argument that the modern concept of the literary or its historicity is bookended by two extraordinary translations from the 18th century from two non-European languages, one Arabic, the other one Sanskrit. The first one is Antoine Galland's translation of an Arabic collection, which later became known as the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. This translation he published in 12 volumes between 1704 and 1717. The second translation is William Jones's translation of Kalidas's Shakuntala, which was published under the title Shakuntala or the Fatal Ring. This translation appeared in 1789. Now, Galland's translation of an Arabic story collection, without any clearly defined author or original source, radically altered the idea of what counted as literary in Europe and elsewhere, and inspired countless imitations and spurious translations from an exotic Orient. When Jones came to translate Kalidas's Sanskrit manuscript by the end of the century, he had to find ways to distinguish his translation from this tradition of forgery, and even had to introduce a body of rules that would define the newness of this text. I argue that the new idea of the literary as a sovereign order of textuality, which is autotelic, autonomous, and universal, that Shakuntala and other translations from Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian introduced in the final decades of the 18th century was co-produced with a colonial model of sovereignty. And this historic development took shape where Jones worked and lived from 1783, that is, British India. From the 1770s, the English East India Company established an exceptional rule of law. This was in opposition to what was described quite often as Oriental despotism in India. This new rule of law relied exclusively on the textual universe of native Hindu and Islamic laws, legal digests, and what was often described as codes, legal codes. Colonial administrators sought to translate into English a legal universe that they thought had been around for millennia in India and other parts of Asia, and also wanted to make this legal knowledge part of their everyday governance. This was evident in a number of translations published between 1770s and 1790s, particularly from Hindu and Islamic personal law. Now, these translations from Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic appeared in quick succession and established a legal world made of texts and philological exegesis. Within this new legal regime, texts refer to other texts, intertextual references establish the truth, and eventually the sovereign power of the colonial state was derived through hermeneutic methods and interpretative skills. Of course, this new arrangement was put in place to thwart off the parliament's attempt to annex the new colony under its direct dominion, as was done in, say, Ireland, America, or the Caribbean colonies. But what it produced was unprecedented in imperial history, both ancient and modern. These governmental translations created what I call a model of hermeneutic sovereignty. It soon transpired, however, that in order to maintain the autonomy of the legal regime and also to assuage native anxieties about the new rule of law, the colonial state needed to describe a cultural world within which these texts took shape and within which they could claim supreme authority. Although a cultural universe of the native population made periodic appearances in some of the early works by company officials like James Fraser's A Catalogue of Manuscripts published in 1742, or Alexander Dow's Tales translated from the Persian of Inatullah of Delhi published in 1768, now faced with the challenge of building a functional state, a fuller engagement with this world became a governmental necessity. Some of the colonial administrators like William Jones drew their resources from their earlier works, like he published some translations in the 1780s from Persian and Arabic, most notably Hafez's Persian Song published in 1771, and the pre-Islamic poem cycle called the Muallakat published in 1782 from Arabic. He drew his resources from these earlier attempts and now produced new translations from Sanskrit like Kalidas's Shakuntala 1789 and Jayadev's Git Govinda 1792 with copious notes and commentaries. Others engaged with local languages and scribal traditions and sought to make available a cultural and intellectual world that was inaccessible to any European mind so far. This would include Abraham Hyacinthe Axel Duperreau's French translations of Zendavesta 1771 and Upanishad 1786, and Charles Wilkins's translation of Bhagavad Gita 1785 and Hitopadesha 1787, among many others. Now, apart from these volumes, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, established in 1784 with Jones as the president, started publishing translations and extensive researches by colonial officials on local languages, religions, cultural practices, and just about everything they found remarkable among the natives in its official publication called Asiatic Researches. From 1800, the College of Fort William in Calcutta published a large number of translations from different Indian languages, along with grammars and dictionaries, in its attempt to train young colonial writers or clerks who arrived from England. Within a couple of decades, the company was able to generate a textualized world of native culture and religion, a world sustained once again through philological and hermeneutic conventions that was ready for both citation and circulation. Now, these two worlds, legal and cultural, were co-produced in an attempt to secure a form of political sovereignty that would have been able both to explain the colonial regime to its governed population and to appease the critics of the company back in England. My suggestion is that the idea of sovereignty that emerged through this shared world of law and culture was derived neither from any normative structure like the Carl Schmittian idea of the rule of exception or Agamben's idea of bare life, nor from any British legal institution like the British Parliament, but from the constitution of an autonomous textual universe of local laws and codes anchored in an equally textual realm of cultural everyday. It was in this shared world of law and culture, in the constitution of a hermeneutic sovereignty, that the modern idea of literature took shape. Now, in the era of expanding imperialism, however, this history was neither produced locally, nor was its circulation restricted to British India alone. Very soon, this colonial history saturated Europe and found its way into literary texts, critical discourses, philosophical treatises, political pamphlets, and in just about every other document that took up literature for serious and sustained discussion. It was this history that constituted a specialized language and an epistemic field, within which, from this point in history, literature had to be cited and analyzed, its properties disentangled and scrutinized, and its very being understood as forming a distinct mode of textual organization. Contrary to standard literary history that traces the birth of the literary to German Romanticism, I suggest that Romanticism was indeed a later consolidation of colonial history and the alien cultural world it embodied. My wager, rather, is that the powerful idea of world literature deployed by both Goethe and Marx was the conceptual grid through which Europe sought to make sense of the newness of colonial history. A close stuttering of an anthropological description of the world and an aesthetic ideal of the literary allowed the idea of world literature to carve out a domain of impure aesthetics that not only facilitated what Jacques Rancière calls the democratic petrification of modern literary culture, it even made the otherwise autonomous literary texts a precondition for national sovereignty. So to conclude, my argument would be that once the myth of Romanticism as the originary point of our modern idea or modern conceptualization of literature is set aside, we are led to the bewildering profusion of manuscripts, languages, tribal traditions, translations and untranslatability, appropriations, pseudo-authenticity, plain forgery, philological claims and counterclaims, archival records, disciplinary rivalry, all of them put together like an enormous jigsaw puzzle by imperial networks. One's job as a literary historian then is not restricted to putting the pieces in their proper order alone, but is rather extended to a multidisciplinary inquiry across texts and territories to track a global history of literature. It is here, I think, we can think of a more important and productive South-South collaborative research as a way to decolonize the discipline of literary studies. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful, Dr. Bhattacharya. You've introduced us to a range of possibilities with your lecture. And in a sense, you've taken us to a micro-analysis of cultural data to a macro-analysis of cultural data. So I think that goes very well with what we are talking about here. And you also introduced us to context of textual variance. How do we then read variance? You've interestingly also talked about how we can look at now look at a range of texts, probably from the larger global South, although we have problematized that concept in the lectures that we had yesterday. But to just use that term, you've also problematized it and problematized conventional discursive means to then access them. And as the discussions have emerged, at least the lectures that we heard today, translation therefore becomes a very important then index of reading this variance. So I think we have some questions, and now we will also have Professor Bhattacharya for the roundtable. So if you have more questions for him, you can still continue. And some of the questions that Professor Bhattacharya raised, I'm sure Professor Chaudhary will also take it up related to literary historiography, because that is something that she often writes about the problematizing of the way that we write literary historiographies, and the problems of then relating it across temporal and spatial lines. So Professor Mala Pandurang has posed a question for Justice. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Draupadi, I was asking Justice, and he has very kindly responded. I had a couple of queries about the acceptance of Kiswahili by countries in West Africa, and I also wanted to ask him about the acceptance of Kiswahili by the Arab states in North Africa. Although I'm aware that initially, I might be mistaken, Swahili was written in the Arabic script, and now it is written in the Latin script. So will this in some way ease the kind of acceptance as a connecting language through all these various different cultural demographics of I also wanted Dr. Justice to perhaps comment on the fact that Swahili also has taken up a lot of, has been influenced by Urdu and Gujarati because of the transoceanic exchanges. It has been a language of trade. And perhaps therein lies very rich possibilities of exchanges between Indian academics and African academicians who are looking into the roots of the language and possibilities of exploring historical exchanges that have taken place in terms of oceanic dialogues and exchanges. I visited the historical archives in Goa some time ago, and I was fascinated to see documents, that is earliest letters that were written in Swahili are actually housed in the archives in Goa. Yes. Thank you.
Justice, can you respond? Hello.
Yes, Drupadi, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. First, I need to appreciate the other two presenters, including Professor Bhattacharya, for the illuminating insights that they have given us. It's wonderful that I hear Agamben being mentioned from that side. Wonderful. I really like that. Anyway, the thing is, I had already responded to Professor Mala Pandurang, but I will say it again. I'll give another response here for the benefit of all the delegates in this room. The first question is about the acceptability of African, the acceptability of Kiswahili in West Africa, putting in mind that it is an East African language in terms of origin and circulation of use. So I don't professor that there are two things here. One is West is just but one region or regional bloc that makes up the member states of the African Union. So the best way to look at whether Kiswahili is receiving favorable acceptance in West Africa is by looking at what African Union, the continental body bringing together all the member states, is doing in support of Kiswahili. So last year on 3rd of April in Addis Ababa, in a heads of state meeting or summit, the African Union mandated the African Academy of Languages, which is the institution under the African Union, which is charged with the propagation of policies regarding African languages and their health. And the African Academy of Languages was mandated to popularize Swahili across is to ensure that we have regional blocks meeting under the auspices of the AU. Translator of Kiswahili language is present for purposes of these for purposes of the visibility of this language in such spaces. So for example, if West African region is having a meeting under the ECOWAS, the Economic Countries of West African Society Association. If they are having a regional meeting in West Africa, maybe in Nigeria or in Mali, but under the auspices of the AU, then they will have representatives of the language there as translators, etc. Equally, documents emanating from such a meeting, regardless of whether it is a regional one or whatever, but it is under the auspices of the AU, such documents will also be translated for archival purposes in Kiswahili. So this is a very proactive campaign that is ongoing. And indeed, West Africa is part and parcel of the rest of the continent. And of course, we have also had some West African writers like Aikwe Ama from Ghana, who is a non-native speaker of Kiswahili, supporting Kiswahili as a neutral language of continental interlocution, locution, and iteration. On the second note, the constituent languages that have contributed to the lexicography and orthography of Kiswahili as a language of continental and regional communication. These languages are many, but the most prominent one is Arabic and the Bantu native languages that are common in this part of Africa. In Eastern Africa, we have the Bantu group of languages. Think about them in terms of language families. The way we have the Germanic language families in Europe, the way we have the Slavic language families in Europe, maybe the way we have the Indo-European family of languages out there. So if you are thinking about Bantu as a linguistic family, you discover that the regions of Africa which have the highest number of Bantu speakers include Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Namibia, Mozambique, Angola, South Africa itself, etc. Then you also have Central Africa, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, etc. Then you have Eastern African, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. These three regions, Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, have very huge populations of native Bantu language speakers. So for them, Kiswahili is not really a burden in terms of orthography, lexicography, and so on and so forth. It's not a burden because their own mother tongues gives them a kind of access to Kiswahili, as it were. And maybe this makes it more susceptible for the spread of Kiswahili in these regions. As I have said, in Botswana, for example, far away from East Africa, they are thinking of legitimizing Kiswahili as a language of education in their system. Yet they are not East Africans where Kiswahili comes from. But of course, the Northern Africans may not find it difficult because part of Kiswahili emanates from Arab language or Arabic language because of the mercantilian ties between East Africa, Zanzibar, Oman, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are also there is also a little bit of Gujarati and a little bit of Urdu, a little bit of languages of Mumbai region, Gujarati, Pondabar, that kind of places. So the languages of that monsoon neighborhood are familiar to the Kiswahili language in terms of loanwords, etc., etc. Initially, indeed, Professor Malapandurang, Kiswahili was written in Arabic script from the 11th century. And for 9 centuries, it existed under the Arabic script because this was the script that was popular and available in the long east coast of Africa, all the way from Muscat to Mogadishu, down to Lamu, Malindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar, all the way to Cape Delgado in the Mozambican Channel. Kiswahili was a language that was a language of trade, and the best way to write it down in terms of contracts, business contracts, title deeds, trade pacts, etc., was to write it in the alphabet that was available at that time. And that alphabet was Arabic. But with the coming of British imperialism in the 19th century and the introduction of the Latin script, Germans, to begin with, followed by the British, managed to export the language from its Arabic script to the Latin script. And this is the script in which the language is existing now. So what we have now in terms of Arabic language Kiswahili scripts are extant manuscripts, which can best be read as classical manuscripts, as it were. And they are basically manuscripts of liturgical kind in the Arabic sense, Muslim sense, maybe kept for religious purposes and religious documentation. But secular Kiswahili, in terms of literature, in terms of cultural interaction, in terms of language and communication, is expressing itself in written form using the Latin script. And I think this is something that is part of the colonial inheritance, something that came with the colonial inheritance, the Latin script. And it is even more interesting for you and Professor Bhattacharya here, that Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes in Gikuyu, but he uses Latin script to write Gikuyu itself, which is again is a paradox. Okay, you are writing in Gikuyu, but you are using the Latin script. So how full is this linguistic emancipation that you are espousing? You know, those are some of the dilemmatic situations that an African writer finds himself with. You are writing in your native language, but you are using the Latin script. You are writing in your native language, but you are using the Arabic script. The bigger question then is it possible for us to come up with a script of our own, which then will be truly a decolonizational strategy like no other in history? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Justice. We have two questions for Dr. Bhattacharya. One is a question that Dr. Chaudhary, Professor Chaudhary wants to ask. And the other question Shinjini has asked. So I'm just going to read out Shinjini's question, and then Dr. Chaudhary, Professor Chaudhary can ask you the question. She says that the earlier phase of colonial codification, as you said, earlier form of colonial codification itself was pluriform, as it moved later towards a standardized codification in the form of law, which she calls universalizing imperial judicial order, and then the Indian Penal Code. In short, a more universalizing judicial order took shape. What changed in terms of generation and circulation of cultural data? All right. So this is one question that we have for you. And I think Professor Chaudhary, you can go ahead and ask him the other question, and you can take both the questions together.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, Boydik.
Hi.
So tell me, would you rather take that first, and then because my question is really very different. Do you want to take that first? Yeah. And then I'll ask? Yeah, is that okay?
Sure.
Great.
This was from Shinjini, right? Shinjini, thank you so much for the question. See, these, of course, happened gradually, and by the time you have the Indian Penal Code, you have somebody like Thomas Babington Macaulay, the Indian Penal Code in that way. What I was trying to get at is an earlier phase, which is between 1770s, let's say, and 1800. It actually started in 1772. There was a major shift in the policy. You know, one thing we need to realize that this was an unprecedented arrangement, political arrangement in imperial history, where the British East India Company, which was a joint stock company, functioned like a state, right? It had almost all the characteristics of a proper state. So a joint stock company functioning as a state. Now, in around 1770, there were several scandals, including famine in Bengal, and also all these English administrators going back to England with huge amount of money. They were called the nabobs at that time. That created another major scandal that the company was basically plundering, right? So that created some sort of tension in British political circuits. And the British Parliament was really eager to take over the new colony, just like they did in the Americas, for instance, in Northern America or in the Caribbean. We need to realize that in 18th century, this is the new phase of colonialism, where the British British Empire is primarily shifting from Northern America to South Asia, that is India. They are losing their North American colonies and they're coming to India. And in fact, one of the major figures behind this new legal regime, Lord Cornwallis, was the person who lost that battle in America, that American War of Independence. So there are important shifts taking place from Northern America to South Asia. What they wanted to do, they wanted to thwart off this attempt by the British Parliament to take over. As a result of which they said, we actually have a perfectly functioning legal system, which is based on the native legal practices. Unlike the Northern America or Caribbean, for instance, or even Ireland, they said India is in possession of its own legal traditions, both Hindu and Islamic laws, which have been around for centuries, if not millennia. What we are trying to do, we are codifying them and we are implementing them. That meant they had to learn languages first. Some of them, like, William Jones was a polyglot, as we know. He knew almost 14 or 15 languages before coming to India. After coming to India, he even learned Sanskrit. And he started large-scale codification. He translated, for instance, what is now called the Manu Samhita. He called it Ordinances of Manu. He also produced Al-Shiraziyah, which is a codification of Islamic laws of inheritance, for instance. This is a kind of argument. They are suggesting that it is different from the legal regime or the sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty that existed in India, which was divested, or which was invested rather, in the body of the despot. Mughals were described as the great despots. So it is a kind of excellent example of Oriental despotism, rule of men. Now we are shifting to rule of law. How do we do it? We do it by textualizing already available native legal words or native legal systems. So this is a very different form of sovereignty than what was already available in Britain. Britain needed an institution like the Parliament. Britain needed a constitution, the monarchy, everything put together to define the idea of sovereignty. Here, what they're suggesting, that sovereignty is basically a textual function, that you have to create this textual world which will justify the sovereign colonial power, the colonial state that they were trying to put into place after they got Diwani rights in Eastern India, including Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765. After the two major battles of Plessis and Bastar, they were trying to erect a colonial state, and they argued that the sovereignty of this colonial state will be derived not from British Parliament, not from earlier political systems like the Mughal monarchy, but from a textual function, where text will actually produce a sovereign power. So that is something I was trying to get at. This later codification obviously is a different story and different history. And my suggestion is that the way we understand literature now, that it's a sovereign order of textuality, it's a sovereign order of textual organization, that my suggestion is derived from this legal world. It's a kind of cusp between law and literature, within which we have the new idea of literature that we still function with.
Professor Chaudhary.
Yeah, hi. I hope you're doing okay for time. So I'll try and keep it brief. And if we're running out of time, we could always take it up later in the panel. It's not a sort of, are we okay for time?
Yeah, we can have like 3-4 minutes. And if there is some question for Professor Vijayakumar, there is, I think, one question that we have to take that. Could you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, so I'll try and keep this brief. So thank you very much, Boydik. I've, as you know, we've spoken to each other before, and I'm familiar with the argument you're making, of course, much of it. Two thoughts, really. So quickly, I'll try, and you really don't need to answer. I mean, I'm just putting the thoughts out there. Maybe we can discuss it in the panel later if it comes to that. Sure. So one of these, is this understanding of literature. So the point is well taken, that world is theorized, whereas literature is not. And in your attempt to theorize the literature part of world literature, you're bringing us to the colonial project and the colonial scene. And you want to argue that literature, as literature with a capital L, if I might put it like that, is originating within a colonial order that is arguing for a sovereign order of textuality. So that point is well taken. Just two questions quickly. One was to do with your evocation of Jones and the search for authenticity. And of course, I'm very familiar with Jones and that period and the texts you mentioned. And you're right in that not only from writers located in England like Southey, but also from writers located like Jones, located in Calcutta. There is a demand, as you know, footnotes are being invented, in order to establish the authenticity of the text, and there is this attempt to demarcate it from, the unoriginal, the fake, the made up. Now, I'm uncomfortable with the category of authenticity as it manifests itself later in the construction of a national history. So the point that I wanted to quickly put to you is whether we could consider, and this is a sort of a thought that I'm putting out there, whether Jones with the materiality of the manner in which he establishes, as you say, a certain search for authenticity in presenting a literary text like Shakuntala to the world, whether that particular search for authenticity, which is material, I understand, and textual, of course, but whether that in some way leads then to the national writers, when they come up, attempting to construct what in fact in the concept note for this conference has been described as a pristine pre-colonial past, to create a homogeneous national culture. That was one. Whether you think that the search for authenticity in Jones leads then in some way to a figure like Dinesh Chandra Sen at the end of the 19th century, who will simply say the Muslim vocabulary in Bengali is inauthentic and foreign and not our literature. Just to put that out there. The second, again very quickly, and I'm sorry that I'm eating up on time, is a fundamental sort of niggling that I've had with the placement of this but this moment when the category of literature is being put in place, your location of it in the colonial project. I hope this is not the nationalist in me that's speaking, but I would put it to you that despite the colonial project and despite Wilkins and Jones and all of these texts from the late 18th century that you mentioned, which is of course very important and consumed not just by the West but by Indian writers themselves, I would put it to you that the category literature is not actually coming into existence in the subcontinent until the subcontinental writers themselves take up the creation of their own literatures. So then you have a fashioning or a self-fashioning that will happen, for instance, and I've written about this in the literary thing, where Bankim will ask the question, what is a poet? And he will say that it is not kavi. It is not the way we understood kavya in the past. The Sanskrit word is kavya. That is not the understanding of kavi. Kavi today means poet. And he uses the English word poet. Something new is happening. And that understanding I am putting to you is being put into place by the writers who are, in a sense, putting the literatures into sort of creating their own literatures in order to put them into circulation. So I'm trying to wrest the agency from the colonial project to the project of the writers themselves. Although I absolutely don't want to do it in any nationalist sense. Because these were writers who very, very much position themselves within a globality of literatures. There's no question about that. So I just put those thoughts out there. Again, you don't need to answer because I understand there are more questions for Professor Vijay Sinha as well. So I'm sorry to have eaten up so much of the time. But I just wanted to articulate these thoughts that came up in relation to what you said today, which was great, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you. So Drupadi, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to respond or reserve my response?
Maybe a short response, and then we can, Professor Rajiva can take his question, and then we can, I don't think we have a time for a tea break, so I think we just have to move to the round table. I hope that's okay with the others. The other panelists, is it okay? Professor Pandurang, Professor Chaudhary.
Yeah, sure.
Perfectly okay.
Yeah. Okay. So please go ahead and respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very briefly, the question of authenticity is something which, in my own work, I deal with in minor details. It's not a question only of the culture, but also of the recension, the particular text that you are looking at. If you look at Jones's kind of introduction to his translation of Shakuntala, he spends very little time on the manuscript itself. He simply says that he got an authentic copy from his teacher, somebody called Ramachan Sen, and he just translated it. The authenticity actually emerges through his reading of the text, that it contains within it an ethnographic description of culture which he still finds available extant in India. That gives him a sense of authenticity of the text. It's not a textual criticism in the Lachmanian sense, Karl Lachmann and others, that how do you establish the authenticity of a particular recension that you are reading. Now, this is a surprising claim because by late 18th century in Europe, which Jones was very familiar with, this was the central idea, particularly with reference to Bible, New Testament, and textual recension question. It was a well-developed discipline, right? And Jones simply ignores that. Rather, he concentrates on this ethnographic description. That ethnographic description of a cultural world inside the text is something which tells him that this is an authentic version of the play. So this is the idea of authenticity I wanted to probe a little bit. And you are absolutely right. Later writers like Dinesh Chandra Sen and others, they took it up. And even in the later case, again, very briefly, I'll see the emergence in Bangla, which you have written about, the emergence of Sahitya, Sahitya as the counterpart for literature. That is precisely the history. But in our existing literary history, the argument is always that it's the Vienna romantics, two Schlegel brothers, their coterie, their publication of Athenaeum and fragments published in Athenaeum that first proposed the idea of literature, and then gradually it became available for imitation or appropriation to others, like us, for instance. This is the literary narrative I wanted to challenge, that it has a larger global and world literary perspective or world literary context within which the sovereign order of textuality was first articulated. And in relation to colonial governance, it was not an independent idea, and it was not an European idea alone either. It was rather the colonial history that produced what we now describe as literature. So very briefly, but thank you so much for your questions.
Professor Vijay Sinha, Shashi Kala has a question for you. So Shashi says that how do you want to create a Sri Lankan harmonious, and she puts it like this, harmonious canon with the three languages that you talked about? So what is your proposal? Pluriform literary culture.
Well, I'm afraid that now that I'm retired, I have rather given up. And I was hoping that younger academics would actually take up, for instance, reviews of the two sets of books that I've already produced on short stories and poetry and comment on it. I'm just very sad that these have not been reviewed here. They have been reviewed in India. And there's just no sense of engaging and sort of saying, these choices are silly, but within this collection of, let's say, 50 poems, here are the 10 that should be kept. Or I would like academics to say, this is the text we should prescribe. In Sri Lanka, there's a terrible sense of studying individual items. And youngsters are expected to just look at individual poems, individual short stories. And in fact, the British Council asked me last week, for years, to do a program. And we discussed the need to have anthologies available at school level, at university level, so that the keen students can dip into other things and then engage with their professors about relative merits, about how meaningful these are in the wider social context. Okay, this may not be, let's say, as poetic a poem, but the substance it conveys is really very important. So I think it's all these aspects that one hopes the new universities would do. We did a lot when we started new English language courses and literature courses at what are termed the new universities. When I was accused of lowering standards by allowing people who didn't have advanced level English. And I'm very glad to say that a large number of them are now in positions in all the universities. But I hope they can take these things forward. But I think it's rather up to a younger generation.
In relation to this, I would like to forward another question related to this. That how do you, given Sri Lanka's very violent communal history, what relationship the new literary canon that you envision, what relationship is it going to have to this new nationalist, uber nationalist discourse that is emerging?
Well, I think the very interesting thing is that what I put together, 4 years ago, doesn't relate to nationalism, either the extreme nationalism of the Sinhalese or the extreme nationalism of the Tamils. In the virtue of the short stories I published, there was much greater empathy. And even, for instance, once the book was published, we did some launches at various universities, and I was able to put together some of the poets, one of whom had been a strong propagandist for the Tigers in the bad days of the war. But, he adjusted very well with the Sinhalese poets on tour, as it were. And these perhaps are idealistic, perhaps rather naive thing to say, but I think good practitioners of literature just do not engage in the extreme nationalism that we saw on either side during the war. I remember once writing 25 years ago in a review when we were editing the first collections, the literary reviews, that I wished the Tamil poets would be sympathetic about Sinhalese massacres of Sinhalese, the Sinhalese poets sympathetic about massacres of Tamils. And over the next 10 years, this actually happened, where you had a lot of empathy. And I just have to believe that good literature in a sense, demands a rejection of parochialism and nationalism. I'm sure there are exceptions, but I find them very rare.
Thank you so much. We had a wonderful session, I think. Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. Thank you, Professor Vijayasena. Thank you, Professor Justice. It was a wonderful discussion where some of the questions that we are going to, I'm sure, take it up in the panel. We're out of time, so we'll just continue with the roundtable discussion. Now I would request Shinjini to introduce the panelists. Shinjini? Thank you so much.
Yes. Thanks, Drupati. So we are we are almost at the fag end, sort of the last section of a series of invigorating and really interesting discussions. And we have a roundtable now. We sort of, the idea behind, after 2 academic sessions, the idea behind the roundtable was that, if we could, there are various issues which came up during the lectures, during the discussions. And, in the roundtable, we have academicians, we have writers, we have practitioners, we have translators. Because these are the issues about writing, about literature, about translation and politics of translation, about the role of linking languages about, and most importantly, what do we understand by South and South to South dialogue. So we thought we could sort of not tie up things. I don't think that's even a possibility, but raise them in a forum, and people could exchange, academicians, practitioners, writers could exchange ideas. So without a further delay, I'll just introduce the panelists. We are very grateful to two of the panelists who have also been there for two previous sessions. Professor Shogato Bhaduri, Professor CS JNU, who delivered a wonderful lecture yesterday for our first academic session. We had a very long and interesting conversation yesterday also. So Professor Bhaduri has very kindly agreed to be present for the roundtable as well, and obviously Dr. Boidik Bhattacharya, Associate Professor, CSDS, New Delhi. Again, we already had with him this very interesting lecture, discussion. We also took up questions, but he will be with us for the roundtable. So thanks to both of you. Thanks a lot. Apart from that, we have Dr. Harshana Rambukwela, Director, PGIE, Open University of Sri Lanka, Dr. Mala Pandurang, Principal and Professor of English, Dr. BMN College, Matunga, Mumbai, Dr. Rusinka Chaudhary, Director and Professor of Cultural Studies, CSSS, Calcutta, and the session will be moderated by Dr. G.J.P. Prasad, Professor CES JNU. So all the panelists, these are illustrious panelists, and their detailed introduction will be given by the moderator himself. So I guess we are left with the tall task of introducing the moderator, and then the moderator will introduce the rest of the panel to all of us. So Dr. Prasad is a professor at the Center for English Studies, JNU, is also a poet, a writer, a translator. His areas of research interest include post-colonial literatures, Indian writing in English, contemporary theaters, Indian literatures and translation studies. He has been a visiting professor at many renowned institutions across the world, University of Paris, University of Cyprus, University of Hyderabad. Some of his select publications include edited volumes, such as Translation and Culture, Indian Context, Writing India, Writing English, Literature, Language, Location, Violets in a Crucible, Translating the Orient, India in Translation, Translation in India, etc. He has contributed chapters to the Encyclopedia of South Asian Literature, Routledge Encyclopedia Postcolonial Literatures, Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature, Oxford History of the Novel in English. He's currently the editor of JSL, the Journal of the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies. He has also been an editor, of focus issues of News India. It's a great honor and privilege to have him here, particularly because some of the organizers have been direct students of his. A few have worked as research scholars under him, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be taught by him, to be guided by him, and he's been extremely kind and extremely sweet, in this endeavor. He has taken out time, and I also need to mention something. I don't know, I guess this gets mentioned a lot in this last few appearances that he's having across various fora, that he's going to retire from the CES in this November. So we all know that CES is going to be a lesser place without him. But obviously we'll have him in other ways, and obviously JNU, I'm sure, will have him in various other avatars. So thank you again, sir, for participating in this, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinjini. This is academic nepotism, if you want. Shinjini and Drupadi forcing me to be a moderator because they want to stop, because they've been my students. etc.
We have been taught well, sir. We have been taught to do exactly this.
Ah, see, it comes back to me anyway. Right. But actually, what I gain from really is the fact of moderating such a wonderful panel of academics who have very different positions, disciplinary positions. And also, by the way, I must say that I'm glad that yesterday I could not join the conference because of issues with the network. But I tried, if you noticed, I tried attending and I couldn't hear a damn thing because of the network issues. So I went off. But today it's been working well. And I managed to hear 3 wonderful people today in the first session. So I think all that will inform the panelists when they speak as well. The panelists have been introduced in a certain sense, but let me give you a few more details about them. Shaukato Aziz, the problem again is that I may be a bit too informal because I know at least 3 of the panelists very, very well. So when I say Shaukato, I mean Professor Bhaduri, and Professor Bhaduri is a colleague. He was a student of mine too at one point of time, and his work, which is on literary theory, most of his career, it includes, he's interested in colonial and literary history of Bengal, contemporary literary and cultural theory, popular culture, etc., etc. His latest book, which is worth mentioning in terms of our conversations here, which must have already been mentioned, which you must have also referred to, and in his lecture, is a book on postcoloniality. And he's talking about ways in which different postcolonialisms inform Bengal and how we should look at various postcolonialisms in India. Boydik, again, Dr. Boydik Bhattacharya. Boydik was also a student of mine. And Boydik is an associate professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, Delhi. He has a number of publications, as Bhaduri has. I've just mentioned one. Same way with Boydik, you can see he's worked on postcolonial literature, but in the era of world literature. It comes through in his talk, in his thing about world literature and the postcolonial. He has co-edited the postcolonial Gramsci, and he's talked about novel formations, Indian beginnings of European genre, etc., etc. Dr. Mala Panduran is an old friend, and we've been in various academic adventures together. He's a professor of English and principal of DMN College, Mumbai. She is she's won so much. She's been a Humboldt Fellow so often, they made her an ambassador. So she's the ambassador for the Humboldt Fellowship in India, and she's been visiting, visits, grants to various places in Germany, and also to the US, to the University of Texas. She has the Charles Wallace Trust grant. She has, also taken an INLAX fellowship. She also received an INLAX fellowship, and the Association of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Her interests include postcolonial writing, diaspora theory, gender studies, but some of the most interesting conversations I've had with her, to begin with, around Africa, around her readings of Indian diaspora in Africa, about her own African experience, etc., etc. Obviously, she has an edited volume on Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Chinua Achebe and African women novelists, etc., etc., postcolonial African fiction. So, a good person to have on a South dialogue. Dr. Harshna Rambakwela, the first person now I'm making acquaintance of the first time. So good to see you on the screen, Dr. Harshna Rambakwela, and he is a director of Postgraduate Institute of English, the Open University of Sri Lanka, author of Politics and Poetics of Authenticity, a cultural genealogy of Sinhala nationalism. So perhaps he can also pick up the question that was asked of Rajiv Vijayasena a while ago, right? And he's a trustee of the Gratian Trust, which awards the Gratian Prize. A bit about it I'll tell you later. And of course, Swarna Awards for the Sinhala novel. He's a member of the State Literary Panel, was a member of the Arts Council of Sri Lanka. He's been in the Institute for Advanced Social Studies and Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, and most recently the Sri Lanka chair at the South Asia Institute, University of Heidelberg. And Rashinka Chowdhury, Dr. Rashinka Chowdhury, because of acquaintance of work, I think of her as a friend, but Professor of Cultural Studies and Director of Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. She was the inaugural Mellon Professor of Global South at the University of Oxford in 2017-18. She has written very well-known influential gentlemen, poets in colonial Bengal, and Freedom and Beefsteaks, Colonial Calcutta Culture, and The Literary Thing, History, Poetry, and the Making of Modern Literary Culture. She also edited Derosio's anthology, the definitive edition, and with L.A.K. Bema, the Indian Postcolonial. Her most recent publication is a history of Indian English poetry in English. As also she's done, introduced complete text of Rabindranath Tagore's letters to his niece, and currently she's working on Bengal and the Empire of Middle Classes. And she is also working on Buddhadev Bose, I think, editing and introducing Buddhadev Bose's writings in English writings of Buddhadev Bose. I'm glad that I'm moderating such a wonderful panel. You know, when Shinjini and Drupadi talked about South-South dialogue and I should moderate a panel, I was thinking of how much we are working within a market culture, right, which works against us, even within our own countries. Justice, who was talking a little earlier about Africa, was talking about how African literature, you know, should circulate, how it should be read. He was talking about translations, and he mentioned, he forgot the name, but he mentioned Professor Harish Narang, a colleague who's translated African novels into Hindi. And so he's talking about how we could actually interact with each other and read each other. And this panel is about reading and writing in the South. And I was saying, when I went to Sri Lanka in the turn of the century, and I was going to bookshops in Colombo and looking around for Sri Lankan books and asking for Gratian Prize Award winners, the book sellers, the shop owners, had no idea what I was talking about. So I could not find, at that time, it's much more famous now, so it's established, well-established prize now, but I think it was introduced somewhere in the mid-90s that I'm sure, you know, Rajiva and all can correct me, but I think somewhere in the mid-90s, who's part of Harshna's part of the Gratian Prize jury and all, trust. Mid-90s, it's established. By the 5 years' time, 2000 and there, no one's heard of it. By now, I'm sure it's well established. But I don't find them in Colombo shops. How would I find them in Indian shops? The question is, how do our books circulate? Rajiva said about how Indians were well known outside India. The problem is, it's a way Indians, and he talked about Sri Lankan writers abroad who publish. It's the Sri Lankans, the Africans, the Indians who have been picked up, are part of a publishing, you know, imprint outside India, outside Sri Lanka, outside Africa, who circulate in our countries, right? Outside Malaysia, outside Singapore. That's how the circulation happens. If you're not published outside, if you're not published in the West, if there's no imprint that picks you up, you don't circulate. And if you don't circulate, right, you are in fact not even well known within your own nation state, if you wish, in your country. So it's one of the things about, I know in Sri Lanka, I know in India, it keeps coming up. I'm sure it comes up in Africa as well, that people who stay on and publish in the country where they are located are very often feel that they are not as well known or as well critiqued, as well received as people outside in the diaspora, or who are picked up or published outside. So when you are talking about South-South dialogues, how are we going to make these connections? How are we going to maintain these connections, right? How are we going to, you know, create the market, if you wish, or fight against the market? How do we establish? So this kind of conference is a way of establishing contacts, right? But how do we build on it? How do we build on it? I mean, as I'm listening to the three talks today, it's completely unfair to base it on three talks, but I'm talking about my general feeling about going to conferences with people, is that we all work within our silos. And what enters our silos now, we're talking about this, how it does it enter. How do we open out? How do we reach across? How do we read each other? How do we, I'm not even talking about how do we write each other. I'm still saying, how do we read each other? How do we read each other? How do we write ourselves is a question we all ask. And that's what the papers have been, you know, in most conferences talk about how we write ourselves. But how do we read each other? I think that's part of the question that when people talk together about themselves, we may be able to come to some kind of understanding about how to receive, how to read. I must say also that Rajiv Vijayasan was talking about the anthologies published in India. I have them. I read them with great pleasure, right? And it gave me an understanding. But then also I must say that because of being in JNU, because of having the colleagues I've had, and also because of belonging to an organization called IACLAS, where we, encourage each other to read around in the old Commonwealth, the new post-colonial nations, whatever you want, however you want. It's a question of how you approach. And we've been all doing that. So that kind of connection, that kind of reading has to go across. It has to permeate to others as well. How does one do this is the question, right? And of course, in JNU, as I said, we had lots of Sri Lankan students, a great interest in research in Sri Lankan literature. And so we've had that connection and we've read. But the texts are still not available. They're still difficult to procure even in Sri Lanka. And you can look around Pakistan, Bangladesh, all countries in Africa, all countries around us, Malaysia, Singapore. How many texts travel? How much do we read? So I'm sorry, I took too much time. I told Shinjini and Drupadi, I will not talk at all. I will just introduce the speakers and then keep quiet, maximum keep time. And I wrote to all of you that you get 8 to 10 minutes for your first presentations. And what do we do? Do we do it like T20 and say, okay, Boydik is warm, he's been talking, so let him start? Do we do that with start with Boydik? Or do we say, let's listen to others first? Because Boydik has had a certain innings that he's played. Boydik, would you like to start? Because the program says you begin.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm happy to.
Sure, you're 8 to 10 minutes.
Thanks a lot. This is exactly as you described. It's a kind of coming together of the old CLE online, of course. What I'll do is very briefly, I want to extend some of the reflections I made in my talk about world literature, but I would rather like to concentrate on the contemporary phase. That what do we do with this world literature, and what Prasad also mentioned that this circulation, availability of book, and what exactly the South means in this particular moment of world literature and globalized world cultures, globalized literary cultures rather. I want to mention a particular project, and I think it can give us some interesting insights into what we can do, what we are capable of doing. This is a project initiated by the South African and now Australian author, novelist, the Nobel winner, that is J.M. Coetzee. Now, Coetzee, in last few years, in his interviews and short essays, have been talking about the idea of a real South. He makes 3 interesting distinctions here. First, he says something called mythic South, which I'm paraphrasing him very crudely, would be something like the idea of South produced through imperialism, through Orientalist forms of knowledge, and so on. The second idea, he says, is global South, which is produced with capitalism. Or you can also say that now, in the combination of capitalism and neoliberalism, this is what produces something like a global South. As opposed to these 2 ideas, that is mythic South and global South, Coetzee is increasingly proposing something called real South. This is an idea I think we can think about, what exactly it means to discuss something like real South. This, in academic discussions, these ideas about what is really real, what is authentic, they play all sorts of things. We become worried about these ideas, that what is real, what do you mean by real South, who's real South, etc. But this is a starting point. Now, the next phase that he does is really interesting. For the last few years in Argentina, he's organizing a yearly conference, which is about South-South dialogue, where he invites writers, scholars, students from this so-called global or real South, primarily from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. And he's suggesting something which I think would be important for us to think about. he's proposing the argument that what counts as literature in our contemporary world market, and this is coming from one of the most successful authors of our time, one of the most important novelists of our time. He's suggesting that what counts as literature, what counts as world literature, is actually determined through a set of institutions, codes, certain conventions, and of course the market, which are primarily located in the north. As a result of this, what counts as literature in the south, the real south, also gets represented through a lens which is primarily a northern one. So Coetzee argues that he becomes canonical because in certain ways his writing fits some of these, if not all, at least some of these demands or some of these conventions. And that is one reason why he has been canonized. He's being taught in different universities across the world, in the northern hemisphere as well. He has received some of the most prestigious prizes, including the Nobel Prize in Literature and so on and so forth. But his central proposition is that we have to challenge this network of codes, of institutions, of prizes, and etc. But this is something we can only do through a South-South dialogue, through a dialogue between what he calls the real South, authors, translators, writers, scholars, students, whatever. So this is a possibility. I think we can think about the way we can, make difference, or the way we can reconceptualize the very idea of world literature in our contemporary time, particularly coming from somebody who is already a canonical figure in contemporary world literature. So I'll stop here. I'll be very happy to listen to others.
Right. That was a very quick first statement. I was giving you 8 to 10 minutes. You took 4 minutes or 4.5. All right. That actually gives us more time to listen to Rosinka Chowdhury. Rosinka,
yes, that was the idea.
Yes. Rosinka, your turn. Have you gone off for a cup of tea?
No, I wish I had. So thank you. I should start actually, since this is actually the start of my formal participation in this event. I should start by thanking all of you, by thanking Drupadi, who wrote to me to be part of this, and by thanking all the participants that are here today, and at the same time by apologizing, because I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, again not due to an internet connection like Prasad, but due to PhD student presentations that were continuing all of yesterday and some of today. So I couldn't really listen in yesterday. I would have liked to very much, but today I did manage to catch most of the papers and benefited greatly as well. I will not take up the extra lot of time that has been so generously handed to me. I will just throw up a few points for discussion. Maybe the discussion can benefit from the extra time. So I was thinking really, with regard to what one can say. It's a fascinating. The reason that I accepted this invitation was because I found the conceptualization of what is called in the it's there in the title of the conference itself, South-South Dialogues, Renegotiating the Pedagogy and Praxis of Postcolonialities. Now, I was very interested in the fact that the word used is postcolonialities rather than post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory or that particular orthodoxy which has been dying for some time now. Not sure if it's dead yet though. In attempting to reflect on some of the issues that that were raised in that concept note, I found that a lot of the work that I have done and have been doing over the years speaks to what was theorized there. So when they spoke, for instance, of, and I say they because I'm not sure who exactly wrote the concept note, but when the concept note, for instance, mentions that they want to do away with the oppositional model of the empire and its other, or when it said that this entire field has been over-determined to a large extent by the centrality of the post-colonial nation state. And I'm quoting now, from phrases from the concept note itself. Then again, what I already brought up in relation to Boydik's talk, the search for a pristine pre-colonial past in our present times, when we want to manufacture national histories and homogeneous national cultures. All of these tie in with many different, thoughts and points that I've been researching and thinking about over the course of my work. I will not do what may have been good for me in what GJV is calling a market culture, which is promote my own, this is what I have said here and there, but just bring up 3 points. Okay, so quickly to address this concept note, to bring up, to maybe I think it may be possible to look at this concept through 3 prisms, if I may put it in that way. The first of these that I will propose is very simple and self-evident, and that is, of course, that one of the ways in which to renegotiate the pedagogy and praxis of postcolonialities is to look at the binary of the global versus the national. So when modernity is theorized, for instance, when Pathu Mitter, who is an art critic, theorized the development of modern art in India in a 2007 book called The Triumph of Modernism, he basically suggested the same thing, that far from belonging exclusively to the metropolis or to the center of empire or to the West, modernity really should instead be regarded as multiply located, and something that engaged with rich vernacular as well as imported traditions. I mean, that much I think is beyond sort of argument. What helps us in understanding what might be an alternative take on the complicated and even contrary affinities and affiliations of, say, India's writers across the 20th century. And these are affinities as well as idiosyncrasies often, which of course, the bold terms like the post-colonial does very little to encapsulate, although it may anticipate them, certainly. It may be possible to do this perhaps by examining the paradoxical fact that, of course, the nation is often a cosmopolitan construction. If I may use a term that is now falling increasingly out of circulation. So it's interesting that there was a time, I think in the 90s, late 90s, 2000, when there was a lot of discussion about cosmopolitanism. I find it interesting that actually with the advent of the global and what you called, the coming of market culture, that understanding of cosmopolitanism has receded, because I think that world has receded also to some extent. What I find useful in theorizing the present is there, for instance, in something that Nivedita Menon, for instance, has called the concept of the post-nation. When she writes in Thinking Through the Post-Nation, she casts the post-nation as referring to the sometimes cross-national, sometimes sub-national, sometimes cosmopolitan material locations from which we all now speak. Interrogating the world picture of transnational and corporatized flows that has allegedly superseded the static organization of the world into nation states, Menon insists on the post-nation as a viable ethical horizon projected beyond the violence and homogenization involved in any process of national emergence. At the same time, however, she concedes that the non-sub and even national identities continue to be expressed in seeming post-national situations, such as, for instance, within India's northeast borderlands. So for Menon, the post-national, broadly speaking, has two dimensions, one over the nation and one under the nation, resisting inclusion in this homogenizing entity by, and I'm quoting her, insisting on space-time trajectories that do not manifest within the progression of dominant narratives of nation and history. So this search, that is encapsulated in this term that Menon coins of the post-nation, leads then to my second point, to my second sort of prism, if you were, which may help us in negotiating post-coloniality, and that is the notion of the ethical text. So I'm just putting these sort of subheadings out there. The first was global versus national, predictably enough. The second was the ethical text. That I want to quickly put out there is the concept of the ethical text. Now, worldwide, across the first 2 decades of the 21st century, there's been a shift away from issues of political resistance and overcoming per se towards a greater concern with the ethical dimensions of intercultural contact and exchange. Even while such criticism remained vigilant about the ongoing imperial project, of course, that cannot be dismissed. This ethical shift bore the imprint of the newly ascendant critical discourses growing up in response to the changing crises and questions of the decade. So trauma theory, Holocaust studies, at that time in response to Bosnia and Rwanda in particular, environmental debates and related eco-critical discussions of the importance of interspecies relationality and interdependence, as well as a growing involvement in keeping with, of course, the ideas of Derrida and Levinas, on the absolute demands of the other upon the self. And all this is used then to explore the invitation of the post-colonial text to think as other, or to submit to the difference of the other's ideational world. The ethical text I'll put to you may also be approached through an emphasis that is laid on literary reading and writing, as inciting or producing an ethical engagement, or on the ethical approach as a response that emerges from close engagement with a text. For Spivak, for instance, reading, to cite one instance, is sacred in offering what she calls a taste of, and I'm quoting her, the impossible status of being figured as object in the web of the other. There is relatedly a noticeable sense of how productive the detachment of the ethical view from the political can be, combined with a palpable interest in the grainy and the embedded. You can see that this is where my heart lies. This is something I respond to myself. So, for instance, Gayatri Spivak asserts via, of course, in her typical Spivakian style, via Kant and then Levinas, that, and I'm quoting her, the discontinuities between the ethical and the epistemological and political fields can be staged by means of the play of logic and rhetoric in fiction. So I'll leave that second point there of the ethical text and quickly sum up. How am I doing for time? I hope I'm all right. Bring up the third point that I just wanted to end with, and which I think there's already been a lot of discussion on already from the previous speakers, which I've called translating cultural traditions. So not so much texts or individual authors, but translating cultural traditions. And here I won't go into, I had written down and I wanted to start with Ramanujan, but Ramanujan's theories of outer and inner poetic form, the Akam and the Puram, all this is well known. You all know it. I won't dwell on that. I'm increasingly now I don't want to eat into other people's time. I just wanted to say over here, in the context of this particular category, translating cultural traditions, that in the context of post-coloniality, the problematic of translating other cultural traditions becomes an important marker for raising questions, of course, as we know, of representation, power, and historicity. The asymmetric relationships of inequality between colonizer and colonized become significant as contesting accounts of relations between languages and races, and peoples, leading to an examination of the technological or practices of power knowledge as they operate through the coercive machinery of the state and within multiple discursive sites, one of which, of course, is translation. So translation then proceeds as strategies of containment, producing versions that occlude the violence that accompanies the constitution of the colonial subject, a hegemony that circulates through various discourses in several registers to produce the status of the colonized as objects without history. These are just disparate thoughts that I sort of pulled up from previous writings, to be perfectly frank, and reorganized in this format in order to just throw up 3 points that I've given my take on and that may perhaps be taken up further in the discussion. So I hope I was okay with time.
Don't worry. Thank you, Rafinka. And it's interesting because the discussions, even today, I mean, I missed completely yesterday's, are coming together from the previous papers as well in these positions. Vaidik will have a few things to say again, I'm sure, later on. I'd like Dr. Harshna Ramakwella to make his presentation now, and we then go to Mala.
Thank you, Professor GJV, and Vaidik, good to see you again after Assam, at least virtually. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me for this as well. And I must also confess that I was not privy to the conversations yesterday. I did listen to Vaidik's presentation and a few. I'm a full-time administrator as well, which means I get less time than I would like for actual scholarly activity. I think, I mean, my thoughts are also somewhat loosely structured. I don't have like a coherent paper in front of me. But what I would like to do is two things. One is to consider the question of the possibility of a South-South dialogue from a conceptual sense, then the challenges that it poses conceptually, and then try and say something about the practical challenges as well to such a South-South dialogue as I see them. And I will speak about literature, but I would also like to sort of slightly step back from literature and take a more interdisciplinary kind of approach, because that's sort of the kind of work that I'm doing now. And I think certain trends, for instance, in historiography and even in things like religious studies, Buddhist studies, may help us think of different models of facilitating a South-South dialogue. Now, one of the major challenges here, I feel, particularly given the history of English studies in South Asia and the ex-colonial world, we have, in a way, to some extent, become trapped in responding to both what was an actual center and what is now something like an imaginary center, made up of the, for want of a better word, the Anglophone speaking or the Anglophone world, and then what were the centers of sort of intellectual and production at that time. So that in a way has shaped particularly the academic discourse in different ways, because at least speaking from Sri Lanka, particularly in relation to English studies, there has been inadequate attention to local languages and therefore certain kinds of local realities. Now, I'm not somebody who believes in authenticity. I wrote an entire book deconstructing authenticity, but at the same time, I feel simply conducting a conversation about the South, the reality of the South, whether it's social, political, or literary, in the English language inherently brings its own limitations. Because those who have accessing to English, those who speak in English, and those who work in English are, quote unquote, to some extent, elite, privileged people within their own societies, to some extent, right? And that then shapes the conversation. And also, if you look at the first phase of postcolonial studies or even postcolonial literature, to a large extent, it was shaped in a way by the concerns of English-educated colonial or people from ex-colonial societies in responding to the center. That was like the first phase. Then it shifts in a way when the nation states, you become independent and the nation states themselves become problems. The gaze turns more inwards rather than to the so-called imaginary center. But to a great extent, so I mean, let's take for instance the idea of sort of decolonization or anti-colonial nationalism. In India or Sri Lanka, it's often framed as a response to European or largely British colonialism. Whether you take history, whether you take literature, often the structurally, like the conceptual structure is always, in a way, anti-colonialism is framed that way. But coming from my own work, for instance, if you turn to the 1920s and 30s, and even to more recent history in the 1980s in Sri Lanka, Sinhala nationalism, for instance, was not always shaped by concerns with the West or British colonialism. The force or the imaginary force, whether imagined or real, were closer to home. Most of the time it was India. So for instance, there was a movement in the 1920s called the Hela Haula, which was an attempt to kind of put forward a completely autochthonous model of Sinhala indigeneity, because the standard mythical framework for Sinhala identity is that we are derived from northern India. The story of Vijaya's arrival and you know, the people, the civilizational influence it had and all of that. But led by this very charismatic Sinhala language scholar called Munidasa Kumaratunga, the Hela Haula attempted at one level, it was kind of a linguistic nationalism. What they did was to say, no, Sinhala is a completely autochthonous language. It has no Sanskrit roots. Therefore, we need to rid it of all Sanskrit influences. And I think there was a parallel movement in South India also with Tamil. Right? So there I feel in some ways even something like Chatterjee's model is inadequate, because it doesn't really take into account that you're not simply responding to the imaginary West, you're responding in a way to other forces closer to home. And similarly now, the Ravana myth in Sri Lanka, there have been several attempts to reimagine Ravana as the hero rather than the villain. And most of that is inspired again by the political economy or of contemporary India-Sri Lanka relationship. So for instance, in 1988, 1 year after the 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, which was very controversial, where sort of India used its regional presence and power in a way to get Sri Lanka to submit to certain demands. 1988, a group of Sinhala intellectuals and particularly one person, Arisan Nahubad, who was part of the Hela Haula, wrote a play reimagining the Ravana myth, where the Rama-Ravana war, where Ravana becomes this wonderful heroic figure. And then again, 2009 post-war, there has been a real resurgence in the Ravana cult. Now, all of this is actually a response to Indian hegemony rather than anything to do with the West, right? And even in things like indigenous medicine, so there is a movement which is resistant to Ayurveda, which comes from India. So there is what is called Hela medicine, like completely local medicine. So my question then is, now from there, I want to sort of also extrapolate now something that has been happening in Buddhist studies. Now again, the story of Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka, particularly with the seminal work done by people like Gananath Obesekara, was framed as a response to Christian missionary work. So Gananath Obesekara terms it Protestant Buddhism, and he is punning on the word Protestant because it's both a protest, literally a protest against Christian missionary activity. It is also Protestant because it adapts adopts and adapts creatively the grammar, the language, the methodology of Christian missionaries. So Buddhism becomes transformed, modernized, where, for instance, there's a greater emphasis rather than on oral tradition, on textual tradition, like Protestant Christianity. Then schools are established, printing presses are established, devotional songs are made. So it takes on like the vocabulary of Protestant Christianity. So this is the dominant model. But recent scholarship has shown that is not really true, because there was what you might call something like a Buddhist cosmopolis, which involved India, Myanmar, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. And there was a fascinating intellectual as well as actual movement of people and ideas between all these centers. So I think one of the problems here is we always see British colonialism particularly and European colonialism as the one dominant force that shaped our histories. And we are still in a way trying to respond to that. And in doing so, we miss other connections, other possibilities that existed in history. So when we go back in history, I think it's very important that we try to move out of that mindset and try to see other forms of connection, other forms of argumentation, other forms of both connection and disconnection that occurred in a regional frame. And that there were other centers to which our nation's nationalisms were responding. Now, one of the big challenges of this, of course, is, and this is where I think the real irony comes, is that the South-South dialogue that we are speaking about here, at a very basic linguistic level, is facilitated by English, unfortunately, because most of us cannot work in the languages of our neighbors. And sometimes internally now, one of my failures is that I don't speak Tamil or read Tamil. So already even within the nation, I am kind of linguistically shut out from one reality. And you can imagine how complicated that gets when you go to a country like India, which has something like 40 official languages, and then all of the other nations that surround it. So we don't have access outside of English. So that in itself creates its own challenges as well. So, and that's the practical dimension I spoke about as well. So my contention is, though, we have to make an effort. And there are, I mean, I have seen some fascinating work, and there, I think the resources that we have available also is a challenge. Now, there's an Israeli scholar called Ronit Ricci. She's now based in Australia. She has done some fascinating work about the translation of the Quran all across the Silk Route into different, and she's multilingual. She works in different languages, and she shows how different forms of cultural appropriation have shaped the reception of the text and how different meanings have been made. So I think one of the things that I have been very conscious about since the time I left university at Peradeniya is to try and consciously look outside at archives, at histories that are not written in English. And to look at sources from other languages. And I've been lazy. I should have actually learned another 2 or 3 languages in order to actually do this work. So there's an irony here, because in a way, some of the the big colonial administrators who were the first anthropologists, who were the first scholars in a way, the beginnings of anthropology were in sort of colonial administrators looking at colonial societies and trying to document practices because they required that knowledge for administration. But those people were fascinating. For instance, if you take someone like Hugh Clifford, he knew a huge amount of language. He mastered them. So I think we need to go back to a model like that as well. And I'm not saying that that this can be done. Like everybody needs to go and suddenly start learning other languages. But I think we need to both make an empirical and a conceptual move. Conceptually, we really need to move out of this idea of the British colonial empire as the one single entity that entirely shaped our realities. I don't think that is quite true, because at many other levels, people, and we have to realize also outside, even in our societies, outside those who did not work in English, there was a large, maybe 90% of the population did not work in English. That doesn't mean colonial sort of knowledge structures didn't percolate down to that level, but their imagination was obviously different to those who were the brown sides, or those who were the, the black skin, white masks kind of, the classic, colonial converts or whatever you want to call it. But the conversation has been dominated by that kind of framework for me, even now. Even though we have consciously sort of tried to get out of that, it's still, I think, to some extent being shaped by that. And I think our ability to do scholarship lies in trying to move out of those frames as far as possible, and to be very deeply conscious about that, self-conscious about that in the work we do. And then I think, Professor GJV, I think you raised a very important issue about the market. And unfortunately, like the publishing market, for instance, and you're right, I mean, even now, a lot of the publishers in Sri Lanka don't know the creation. Which is within the circles where it is known, it's considered sort of the most prestigious prize for English writing in Sri Lanka. But many of the publishers still don't know, and that's to do with how books are marketed, etc., and also access. So I mean, academic publishing is highly iniquitous. So a lot of the studies that are done about for Sri Lanka, etc., are simply not accessible due to cost. So I think that's a different conversation, but the market also plays a big role in this. So that would be my contribution. Just to sum up, I think two big challenges for us is to sort of maybe reconceptualize our approach, where we don't simply look at Europe, British colonialism as the one center to which our societies or our cultures have responded. And to look at other possible connections that existed and that still do exist, and the other kinds of cultural transactions and flows that occur even today. That's one. And then the linguistic barrier, trying to overcome that as far as possible, and to work in ways where our conversations are not simply determined by English. And I'm sorry to say, English does shape scholarship. Now, for instance, or just give me one more minute, okay. All the evils of sort of Sinhala nationalism tend to be heaped upon this one historical figure called Anagarika Dharmapala, who was a religious missionary who was contemporary to Swami Vivekananda. Both of them were at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 or 1889. Now, Dharmapala is taken as the singular figure of sort of Sinhala xenophobia against minorities, etc. But there's a real historical irony there, because Dharmapala is not as unique. If you go back into the history and look at the other people who were talking at that time, Dharmapala actually doesn't sound so different to the others. What has happened is Dharmapala's archive is readily available in English. So that is to what a lot of the scholars turn. But if you turn to other archives that existed, then the picture that you get is somewhat different. So yeah, with that I'll stop. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashna. That was fascinating, especially as a Tamilian, to listen to this. I didn't say, but I went to Colombo bookshops. I couldn't find Tamil books, and I couldn't find translations, which should be true of bookshops around India. I mean, it's part. I'm saying this is part of the problem that we have. All of us have. You can't go into a Delhi bookshop and try to find even Hindi books in an English bookshop. Right. So it's the problem of access, practical problems of conceptualization. When you talked about Ravana, yes, Ravana is a heroic figure in Tamil literature, and Tamil rewritings of Ramayana happened around the same time. In fact, earlier, much earlier. Right. So this whole business of South, and I'm looking at South India, Sri Lanka, there's such a complicated relationship, and it's such a long relationship, right? South India, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. It's a complex, complicated, long relationship. So to talk about South and still tag on post-colonialities is in a certain way saying post-colonial rather than post-colonialities, right? after this? I mean, going back and re-looking at everything, how do we relook at it? How do we make the connections again? I think those are the questions that you also raised. So I'm sorry, I'm reacting very quickly and shouldn't be reacting so much to one person, but because as a Tamilian, I'm so interested all the time in Sri Lankan affairs that I kind of see this. And all right, and we need to give equal amount of time to Mala, to Dr. Mala Pandran.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor GJV. And I intend to make use of the full 8 minutes that you've allocated to me, so I'll get to the point straight away. The theme that you gave us to speak on is reading and writing the South. And like you mentioned at the beginning when you introduced me, my area of interest is the African continent, and therefore I would like to focus on the current status of teaching and researching of narratives from the African continent in the Indian context, particularly because I do believe that literary critical production of the African continent has not been explored sufficiently in terms of South-South pedagogical practices by Indian academia. We are all familiar, those of us who are in English literature departments, and we teach our students also the trajectory of curriculum revision that took place from 1970s onwards to decenter Eurocentric texts on the syllabi of English literature programs. And by 1990s, most university departments had revised their syllabi and put into place newer canons of Indian, American, Canadian, and even Australian literature. And then there was that category that was variously labeled as new literatures in English or Commonwealth writing, third world literature, postcolonial writing, that clubbed together the narratives of the former British colonies under a shared assumption of shared denominators of experience. Unfortunately, to date, such texts continue to be taught only as electives or optional papers. In other words, studying texts from locations such as Africa or the Caribbean is not a mandatory requirement for larger programs in English literary studies. And therefore, in the minds of undergraduate and postgraduate students, texts from these locations do not become sufficiently significant in the larger ambit of literary studies. It is in this context that fiction and non-fiction from the African continent entered the syllabi of English literature programs in Indian universities. And the problem is that to date, it is only one or two texts prescribed for study that are taken to represent the entire literary output of writing from the continent. As Bernd Lindfors, the well-known Africanist, once commented, for most Indian students, literature begins and ends with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And therefore, Africa as a geopolitical and cultural location has remained relegated to the margins. This has resulted in what I would like to refer to as an academic hierarchy and an indirect ghettoization of narratives. I'm therefore a little cautious about using the term Global South as a broad-based category of reference, because if at the end of the day, this will remain yet another huge blanket term under which we put together groups of literatures considered to be part of the developing world, then the term and the nomenclature really does not serve any effective purpose. But this being said, and in view of the conference objective of initiating dialogues to allow us to revisit our pedagogy and teaching practices, I'd like to share some interesting entry points for alternate discussions put across by three eminent writers from Africa. While the term Global South is contextual, and this is what we've been talking about from yesterday, in the mind, it still conjures an idea of a division of two spheres of the globe, okay? The global north and the global south. Okay? So we moved from talking in terms of east and west to north and south. On the other hand, the Kenyan novelist and critic that Dr. Justice had mentioned, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he offers us a concept of what he calls the globalectical imagination in a very interesting paper that he has published in the World Literature Today journal. And Ngugi argues for an ethics of reading that assumes an interconnectedness of time and space in the area of human thought and action. he explains how for long we have struggled against this view of literature as being related to each other in terms of a hierarchy of power. And he proposes that we replace this view by a give and take inherent in the notion of networks. And I think this is what the other speakers have also been talking about. How do we explore and discover newer networks of exchange? What he is suggesting is that when we organize the teaching of world literatures, we should start from where we are located. Whereas in the imperial approach, people would start at the imperial center and work in terms of peripheries and semi-peripheries. And therefore, the global lexical imagination assumes that any center is the center of the world, and each specific text can be read as a mirror of the world. And therefore, this becomes an approach that will allow us to organize and read literatures so that, and I quote Ngugi, the reader from the here of one's existence is taken to the there of other people's existence and back. And this brings us back to the discussion yesterday by Dr. Ipsita Chanda, where she pointed out the primary focus of literature and humanities should remain the need to understand oneself in relation to the other and the interrelationship between the self and the other, however we may define the self and the other. The second narrative that I would like to refer to is Osiris Rising by the Ghanaian novelist Aikwe Arma, which again Professor Justice had referred to. Unfortunately, Arma has not received his due in the kind of curriculum that we prescribe when we teach African literature texts. And what Arma persists is an alternative to how Africa's view can be viewed beyond the framework of the European colonial experience. This is exactly what Dr. Harshana was pointing out too. And he suggests one possible way that we can contest conceptual constructs of European historiography and colonial cartography practices. And he links the whole idea back to European cartographical practices as one of the issues that we need to deal with. And this interesting novel traces the multi-millennial history of Africa, thousands of years back to the rise of the Egyptian civilization, in contrast to the Western historiographers who decided that Africans were not capable of developing their own civilization. And Arma calls himself, and he belongs to a group of African intellectuals who call themselves as Egyptianists. Okay? Now, Egypt figures prominently on the map of Africa. It was a British protectorate, and yet Egypt has not found itself included in the larger theoretical and cultural discourse of even Black post-colonial African intellectuals, because there is this tendency of seeing the south of the Sahara as a relevant cultural delineation, and others take the kind of geographical delineation between forest and savanna. And in this particular novel, his protagonist Asar is involved in designing what is described as a new intelligently adapted curricula, and I quote, to liberate our productive intelligence. And in the act of doing so, advocating a dynamic consciousness of history as a process that goes beyond European poles of reference to incorporate studies of Asian Pacific and Armenian societies. The third writer that I would like to refer to is Tai Selassie, the author of the award-winning novel Ghana Must Go. And this is in an opening speech that she gives at an international literature festival at Berlin. And she contests the very idea of homogenizing an African identity, which again is a common tendency in the way that we approach African literature from Indian university curriculum. And she says that this whole idea of categorizing literature from the continent from which its creators comes is past its prime. According to Selassie, the singular African which we are loath to with African literature just does not exist. And the tendency, as again in the case in our departments, to fall upon a single category of African literature is itself an empty designation. And in doing so, we show a complete disregard for the complexities of African culture and the creativity of African authors. What she champions is a non-national, human-centric approach that goes beyond the acts of labeling texts and creating canons. And I think that there is a danger that every time that we construct our discourse under particular terms or constructs or nomenclatures, within academia, we fall into the danger of kind of constructing newer canons that replace the earlier canon. And I really wonder if at all it is possible to do so, because we are all in the profession of curriculum prescription. Okay? That's part of the profession, and that's something that we necessarily have to do. And finally, if we do want to draw up comparatives, frameworks for discussions using South-South development issues, because inevitably when you talk about global South and you talk about texts from Africa or Latin America or the poorer parts of Asia, it inevitably comes back to developmental issues. But if we do want to do that, then there are multiple possibilities of bringing out these networks and connections and drawing from some very interesting African texts that will allow us to have comparative frameworks with India, Latin America, the developing East, Asia, and the Middle East. The Middle East was something that someone had raised in one of the questions yesterday. I just conclude to suggest a few narratives. You have Somali writer Nuruddin Farah's Maps, which looks at donor dependency relationships between the global North and the global South. You have Inedi Okorafo's science fiction Lagoon, which is a Afro-futuristic tale of the alien invasion of Lagos, and lends itself well to the emerging body of petro-criticism, which is a study of the oil encounter in literature. Then you have Helen Habila's Oil on Waters, which again focuses on the long-term degradation of the Niger Delta, Ngugi's Wizard and the Crow, and it talks about urban discontent and Haile Selassie's Ghana Must Go. But my argument is that these texts need to be what we would kind of say mainstream, rather than being offered in these optional elective papers as a separate category of reading. And I would like to therefore conclude my argument that if we are really going to bring about a change in our pedagogical practices, we have to go beyond academically oriented, conceptual, intellectual, theoretical discussions to the actual prescription of texts. And many of us are in a position to actually talk about the prescription of texts as an integral part of mainstream coursework at undergraduate, starting at undergraduate level, then postgraduate level, and finally when it comes to doctoral level, rather than allowing these discoveries to be done much later in the student's academic career. And it is only when the separation between theory and praxis at graduate and postgraduate level occurs that we can expect for any pedagogical tools to evolve that will in turn allow us and enable us to devise newer strategies of reading. Thank you, Professor Prasad. You online after a number of years. You introduced me as a friend, but you have been a mentor to me.
Thank you.
N number of years. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mala. And obviously a very interesting pedagogical perspective, which makes me wonder whether the whole idea of area studies, the literary studies has also gone into, is perhaps worth rethinking completely. Because if you can't talk about an African and you cannot talk about Indian in the same sense, then do we need to look at other kind of affiliations when you talk about South-South in these sort of dialogues? But that's for others to take up, especially for Professor Shogato Bhaduri, who said he'll be the first one to respond. He said he will not make a presentation, but he would respond to the presentation. So we'll begin the second round, so to say. He'll be the fulcrum. So Shogato, all yours. Can't hear you.
Sir, your mic.
I'm so sorry. I had already begun speaking without realizing that I just put the camera on and not the mic. What I meant to say was that Prasad is absolutely right, that there is very little merit in me making a full-fledged presentation, considering that I made one yesterday. Though most of my panelists, apart from Mala as it appears, weren't there yesterday, but the bulk of the audience was, and therefore it would be indeed repetitive and not particularly fruitful either if I were to just say what I had already said. And therefore, I could instead link what I had said, and thereby probably also saying what I had said yesterday in just a minute or so, because that would kind of help me to blend things together, but primarily respond to what has come up today, because that is probably more fruitful. So to sum up in just 3 sentences or so, what I had said yesterday was that while it is indeed absolutely necessary today to have South-South dialogues, because ultimately South-South being a construct of the contemporary new imperialist, contemporary multinational capitalist developmental rhetoric, it is particularly required so that we can combat that rhetoric, that new imperialism itself, and also we can rethink, introspect, and combat the emergent modes of new fascisms and the emergent modes of insular communalisms and sectarianisms that are pretty much there even in our own South. So that was the rationale, and that's my first point. Out of the 3 sentences that I said I'd sum up my yesterday's talk in, that was my first point. So there is a rationale, and a very pressing rationale for having a South-South dialogue today. But yet, and that's my second point, that was my second point, somehow we fail to have any meaningful South-South dialogue because a particular baggage of post-colonial common sense weighs upon us. And since this particular conference is about not just South-South dialogues, but also to renegotiate post-colonialisms, I thought that it kind of fell in place. And that common sense is that somehow colonization had been primarily mono-national. That is, a part of the world was colonized by a particular nation. So South Asia was colonized by England, Brazil was colonized by Portugal, etc., etc. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch, etc. Whereas, and herein I introduced the concept of polycoloniality, and that's the title of my book, Prasad, not post-colonialities, but polycoloniality. So where I went on to suggest that imperialism, erstwhile imperialism, not just contemporary multinational new imperialism, but even erstwhile colonialism was always already multinational, was already always polycolonial. And I looked at these entanglements of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, the Danish, etc., etc. And my polemical point was that the moment we look at imperialism beyond the post-colonial common sense of mono-nationalism and instead look at it as polycolonial, we are likely to develop a vocabulary that is also plural in nature. And this vocabulary would allow us to contend contemporary multinational new imperialism and would allow us to have a multiphonic South-South dialogue. Because ultimately, if we have only mono-national notions of colonialism, then we would be stuck maybe with Anglophonic Commonwealth literature. So we can have a dialogue amongst India, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, as we are having in this particular conference, but not with a Brazilian, not with an Indonesian, and not with, as increasingly yesterday also it was brought up and Mala referred to it, the Arab world. And today Sukhdev has asked a couple of questions about China, which are all part of the global South. So we leave out several blocks, and a polycolonial understanding gives us the vocabulary to do that. And furthermore, plurality itself allows us not to be hegemonically insular, not to be binaristically in a Manichaean manner, parochial in trying to always propose what is the basis of sectarianism, what is the basis of xenophobia, and have a more hospitable discourse, and thereby enabling South-South discourse. And the third point that I made was that polycoloniality, as I have studied only in the case of Bengal, might become a template, therefore, for renegotiating the praxis and pedagogies of postcoloniality per se. And that would be very important in initiating the absolutely essential South-South dialogues. But that is to sum up my elaborate presentation yesterday in this 3 sentences. But today, some very important points have come up, and I'd like to therefore comment on them and connect my intervention today with that, in a way of course, as Prasad said, therefore having almost initiating the closing remarks chapter of this particular roundtable. Today, very majorly, the question of world literature had come up. And again, one wonders that when we are talking about South-South dialogues alone, when we are talking about Southern interrelations alone, are we again developing some kind of a cocoon, some kind of an insular module, which in a way doesn't allow us to be truly receptive of or truly open to the world, because the South is only a part of the world and not the whole of the world. So do we, and I'll just return to world literature in a minute, and through Boydik's very important point about Kudzi's idea of how the South can intervene there in the real South, so to say. But more importantly, is there a possibility, a likelihood, if we harp too much on South-South dialogues alone, is there a possibility of us compartmentalizing ourselves once again, fetishizing the South, as it were, forming the South also as some kind of a holy cow, as some kind of a very insular, very self-contained discourse, fetishized, reified, so to say, and also therefore it becoming, in a way, the vaulting horse, so to say, of another kind of sectarianism, which a fetishization of the South is likely to do, and which feeds in very, very nicely with some of the points that Rosinka had brought up, and in a way Harshana also, about these nationalisms, the dangers of nationalism, the dangers of southernisms also, the dangers of any such insular claim to a certain bloc as having been probably better than, I mean, politically more legitimate, so to say, in any resistant discourse today. So this fetishization of the South is something that today's discussions kind of struck me as very important, and something that we need to negotiate if we have to have any meaningful conversation about South-South dialogues, lest we lapse into such a fetishization, which would necessarily prove counterproductive, and wherein this whole problems of nationalism itself, which emerged today in Rosinka's talk and in Harshana's talk, and how nationalism has its own pitfalls, so to say, I think that in a way, revisiting the category of world literature, albeit with a difference, albeit with a certain perspectival difference, a methodological difference, which Boydik tried to point out vis-a-vis Kudzia, that the idea is to do world literature, but probably world literature in itself, or who gets presented in world literature, it's still being redefined with South as a method. The South-South dialogues becoming not an ontic category of certain nations now trying to assert their let's say own problems vis-a-vis the global North, but southernizing, almost becoming a method to southernize world literature. So rather than just having South-South dialogues, insofar as I yesterday also talked about our entangled imperialist histories coming into foreground, or in terms of even what came up today, that apart from us, our southern bonds being defined only through European imperialism, we have had our own interlinkages with the Arab world, with Africa, with Southeast Asia, with India. These have had interlinkages through old pre-colonial trade routes, etc. But rather than looking at South as an object, rather than looking at South-South dialogues as a discursivization of that reified, objective, ontic status of the global South, could we, and this is precisely with which I would like to end my discussion, could we talk about southernizing as a method, South-South dialogue as a method with which we need not study the South at all? I mean, even when we are studying literature of the North, let's say, when we are studying truly in a world literary sense, rather than cooping ourselves up within the ghetto of only Southern literature, even when we are really opening ourselves up to world literature per se, can our method be that of Southernizing? can a method be that of what would be a southern mode? And to end with what Rosinka very nicely raised, and that would be really the very final point, the ethical point. Would this southernizing as a method and having a South-South dialogue with this perspective, this method, be an ethical thing to do? Ultimately, should reading literature and reading Southern literature, having South-South dialogues, having the plural modes of connecting the different countries of the South, the different polycolonial realities of the South in today's gravely sectarian times, should that primarily be an ethical project, an other regarding ethical project where Southernizing becomes a method, South-South dialogue becomes a
Sir, your microphone.
I did the same mistake. As I said, what we'll take away from here is what is Southernizing as a method? What would that entail from what Sir Gurudas said? And I was thanking him for raising this. But I'm sure the panelists here, all of them will want to come back with a quick response to each other, including to Shogoto, obviously. So I was keeping him at the fulcrum of this panel. But I'm sure all of you, any of you can start off. I'm not the great one for method. I won't say you first and you second kind of thing. Whoever feels like talking, please, immediate responses. Put your hand up if you wish, or just start talking. You want me to say, Boydik, your turn? Okay, Boydik, your turn.
Okay. The idea of this Southernization as a method is well taken. But this is something we have been doing for a very long time, not only in English departments or literature departments rather, but across disciplines. Just to take one quick example, this idea of connected history, something that Sanjay Subramaniam has been writing about for a very long time, or say something like Janet Abulugh's work on various trade routes and what she describes as before European hegemony, that different forms of globalized trading territories which came together before Europe became one of the major players from 14th century onwards. Prior to that, so this form of connected history and connecting something which would look like South-South dialogue today has been around for some time. What is important to recognize and to address, this is something I just tried to do in my presentation as well. That's why I didn't repeat it all over again. But since we are discussing this, I may as well just summarize the point. The point about colonialism, which Harshana also raised, and the question of nation or nationalism, which both Rosinka and Shogoto raised today, we need to realize that this is something which came together only in the last 200 years, right? Up to 18th century, as my work hopefully demonstrated, we had a very different form of cultural exchanges without Europe having one, or which in today's language would be the global north, which is basically Western Europe and Northern America, without them having a hegemonic situation. So that history needs to be revived, that history needs to be recognized. That is one primary step that Shogoto also mentioned, that Southernization means recovering these lost histories. What has happened that this idea of colonialism, whether by one nation or multiple nations, gave rise to this strange cage of nationalism where we have forgotten our connection with our neighbors, for instance. Because of India's present-day map, for instance, we completely, we have forgotten completely the rich cultural traditions that we had with Southeast Asia, for instance, between South Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, because the map ends here, there is no recognition of the countries lying beyond our borders, that we had a very rich cultural heritage, trading connections with them, because of the way nationalism and nation state closes off these boundaries. This is something I think we need to recognize and address. When we are suggesting something like South-South dialogue, we need to go beyond this insular framework that the nation state imposes on us and then claims to be a natural outcome of history.
Right. Rasinka, are you around?
Hi. Sorry. Hi. Yeah, so very interesting set of reflections from all the speakers. I'll just quickly sort of go through some of the thoughts that came up while various speakers were presenting their points. One of the most important points raised today really was an almost throwaway remark that you made, Prasad, on market culture. We haven't had much time to dwell on it, but it came to mind when Boydik was telling us about Kudzia's project, in Argentina, where he's proposing that what counts as literature in the world is determined by codes and conventions made in the North. I was thinking of Bourdieu, and I was wondering how much of that he took from Bourdieu. But the immediate doubt that comes to one's mind when one hears a category such as the real South, apart from the dislike of the word real, is that nobody would pay attention to it if it weren't being done by Kudzia himself. And Kudzia is recognizing that, of course, I acknowledge that. But also that really so much of our discussion of literature and what counts as literature and what shouldn't count as literature is determined by the market. So a lot of what Professor Pandurang was saying regarding African, writers and how they mustn't be ghettoized. And I was thinking, well, look at what a huge celebrity Chimamanda is. Whereas, and one has read her books, and and one doesn't read those books specifically as reading Africa. One just reads them because one has heard she's a good writer, and you want to read, good writing. So who determines what good writing is? And a lot of that now is the market. One doesn't want to, in literature departments especially, a lot of it is determined by the simple long list and short list for the booker. I mean, it is the entire thread of all this, whether it's South-South or whether it's even approaching a fetishization of the South or not, is determined, it seems to me, by the market. So that was one thought that kept persisting in my mind as several sort of speakers spoke. What Professor Rambukwala said was very interesting to me about internal colonialism. The making Ravana the hero, Michael Madhusudhan Datta did that in his epic, the Meghnad Bodh Kabbo, which was published in 1861, but of course, the way in which it has been read in our literary history is that this was done because he read Milton's Paradise Lost, and he wanted, after the fashion of Milton, to make Satan, making Satan the hero, he wanted to privilege Ravan. I think it was a little more complicated than that, which is why your point about internal colonialism and the fact, of course, and this is a point that writers make again and again. We pay very little attention to what writers themselves are saying, but writers again and again make this point that and you will find it in literary history as well, if you look at their writings, that they were not so much responding to the colonizer or to the West as to, in fact, hegemonies within their own literary cultures. So that's a point very well taken. Quickly, to just stay with another point that came up again and again in Professor Rambukwala's discussion, was this whole thread that exists and that we tend to sort of fall back into again and again, of English being the language of the elite. English is the language of the colonizer. Yes, of course it is. I mean, far be it that I don't acknowledge that it is. I just like to point out what something all of us here in India know, but just because it hasn't come up, I'll be the one to mention it, is the fact that, of course, one of the most important sort of, groups that are championing the use of English today in India is from among the Dalit writers. There is actually a statue to the Angrezi Devi, which is the goddess of English, and the Hindu actually printed a picture of this goddess in a hat and a handbag. But the Dalits basically privilege the English language because it does not bear caste markers, because it does not bear the marks of oppression that they have had to contend with over the centuries. So, so again, this is the point everybody knows, so I won't go into it, but just to, bring a little bit of sort of, a dissension into this whole construction of English as a language of privilege and the elite and all of that. With regard to Shogotu's very interesting observations on polycoloniality, and I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet. I must do that. But it struck me as he was speaking about multiple nations, and I was interested to hear you say that you base it in Bengal, because of course immediately what came to mind was a vision of the Hooghly and the Dutch at Chinzura and the French at Chandanagar, and that entire spatial map almost of all these polycolonialities, just these multiple nations. But then also to make the point that, of course, within the nations themselves, there were fractures, in the sense that it wasn't the English actually that colonized us, but within the British colonization of India, there were the Scots, there were the Welsh. Jones, very much a Welshman, no question about that. The Scottish Enlightenment, very important to Drummond, Derozio, and those figures right at the start of the whole project of writing. So just to point, and I'm sure perhaps you made the point in your book already, so perhaps you'll tell me that, but that just came to mind, that the nations themselves are not homogeneous categories. So the polycoloniality is within the multiple nations. The nations themselves are fractured. Those were just thoughts that came up while people were speaking. Thank you very much for the wonderful interventions that I've had the chance to hear today.
Thank you. And that's the nature of a round table, that this will be throwaway remarks. We will think about it as we go away. The turn, if you don't mind, I'll give this to Mala, and we'll then end with Harshana. Mala?
Yeah, thanks. I really don't have, because I think most of what each of us had to say has already been touched upon by the other panelists. I was just thinking about some things that kept coming up over and over again, is that the very basic definition of literature, again, which has been contested. And when we have terms like the real literature, then exactly, or the real South, and then what is a real literature from the real South? Are we bringing discussions of popular literature into this larger ambit? We have not really touched upon readership. We have not talked about audience. We are talking about perspectives of those of us who are approaching the text from a critical angle. But then, who exactly is the readership? And then the whole idea of the marketplace and what the readership demands. There are various genres like chick lit, which is popular across all these locations. There is graphic literature. There is digital thing that's being produced online. And maybe the paradigms of looking at these areas of production would be quite different from the way that we look at how we are looking at what defines literature. And also to coming to the question of English being a language of privilege, this debate goes back, a very, very, very long time, and it's been a debate that has been up over and over again. But also the whole idea of the new education policy that's now talking about a 3-language formula. And perhaps a 3-language formula, of course, it's very debatable, but will that 3-language formula then change the complexion of readership in the future? And then will the readership in turn change the kind of text that get produced and how they get read? So these are just some responses from my end.
Thank you. Ashna?
Yes, thank you. I think the other panelists covered most of what I would also want to say, except for me. I mean, I was just thinking of one thing. One is this, particularly the presence of the nation state in all our lives. And the fact that globally the conversation was maybe 5 years or 4 years ago was shifting towards this idea of like a post-national world. But now suddenly with COVID, and what's happening in places like America and the UK and even in parts of Europe, nationalism is very much back, right at the center of what we do. So what I was thinking as a critical practice is, and then this would relate to the idea of a Southernist critical practice as well, as Southern not as defined as a geographical, cultural category, but as an ethical orientation, would be what I would call the ideational level of critique, where the ideational level would be what broadly would something that somebody like Edward Said would talk about, looking at connectivities between cultures, that cultures are not isolated entities, that they are always imbricated in each other, they co-produce each other, there are complex messy ties between cultures. So that is the ideational level. Now, I mean, you can use different terms, cosmopolitan, etc. All of these have contested histories. So I would just say that as critiques, that is sort of my own ideational view, and the old-fashioned term for this is human, which is, of course, has been deconstructed so much, form of humanism. But that ideational has always got to be paralleled by a very rigorous commitment to looking at your local context and the structures of power that operate in that. And in that, you cannot forget the imprint of the nation state. As Baidik rightly pointed out, it is something, a very recent phenomenon. But as the British philosopher Ian Hacking says, the nation state is a prime example of what he calls an interactive kind. He talks about two kinds of phenomenon in this world. One are indifferent kinds and the others are interactive kinds. Indifferent kinds are things like trees, stones, rocks, anything. You name them, you label them, you categorize them. The rock doesn't mind, the tree doesn't mind. The tree goes on living its own tree life. But the moment you name a collective, a human collective, give it a name, give it an identity, that identity takes a life and it becomes a social reality. It might be a fictitious construct, it has no ontological status, but it is real. People will die for it, people will kill for it, as we all know. So therefore, I think it is sort of, it's a balancing act. So your critical practice has to be ideational on one hand, looking at those connections, but you can never forget the politics of the nation states and the politics of the local. And then it's this balancing act I think we have to practice. And for me, that would be a Southernist critical practice. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashna. It's been a fabulous panel discussion. We could just go on, I would think. Lots of thoughts in my head, in my own head. If I have lots of thoughts, I wonder what you guys are like. Right, so, but I think we must bring this to an end because we're way beyond time, I realize. And I'm wondering why the organizers haven't sent me personal messages saying you should end it at some point of time. But I can see somebody smiling at me. So all yours now. Thank you all. Thank you for the panelists. It has been a wonderful discussion. And I don't think we should want to take any questions from anyone at this moment. It's all to the organizers.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot for moderating the panel. And thank you very much for all the panelists for coming in and delivering or making us think beyond our little boxes. It falls on me to do the thank you speech, so bear with me while I read out names because this is what is required of me at this point. Thank you very much to the Vice Chancellor of SNDT Women's University Mumbai and the Principal of Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, Calcutta, for supporting my colleagues to organize this conference, and also to the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, Calcutta, for supporting the conference and giving all the necessary support to carry on a task like this. and to our three wonderful heads of departments, Dr. Manisha, Dr. Parmita, and Dr. Prabha. Dr. Prabha is not here today, but the other two HODs are here. Thank you very much for the support. Thank you very much for coming in to the meetings at godforsaken times and, tolerating all of us yapping when we were organizing this conference. My sincere gratitude to all the speakers who agreed. I'm not going to name them, but all the speakers who agreed, even without us prompting, to speak, and also to, especially because I'm speaking from Sri Lanka, let me be slightly partial to the two Sri Lankans who didn't have to be bullied actually to say yes to this. Thank you very much, Professor Rajiva Vijayasinghe and Professor Harshana Rambukwala for agreeing to do this over a simple telephone call. And my sincere and special gratitude goes to two of my former professors, Professor G.J. Prasad and Professor Bhaduri. It was wonderful to see you, sir, after a long time, and we all three of us are extremely grateful for your presence and your contribution. This wouldn't have been this jazzy had we not had Drupadi's students doing the posters and the brochures. Thank you very much to Lakshmi and I'm sorry if I don't remember your name, but Meenakshi for doing the wonderful posters and for tolerating us when we kept going back and forth trying to correct the posters to make it look beautiful. And all the participants, thank you very much for joining in and taking time and your valuable data to join into this conversation. And all of our students from 3 individual institutes who were either coerced into attending or who came voluntarily. Whichever the way you came in, thank you very much for your presence. And also, thank you to whoever invented the World Wide Web, because that is why we got to do this. Thank you to the pandemic, because there are good things coming out of the pandemic. I'm now sort of rattling on, but thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in, and thanks a lot for all your support. Thanks a lot for all your great questions, and for people who have been asking us constantly about the feedback forms. We'll get it to you later tomorrow. I have a request from my co-organizers. If everyone can please turn on their videos, we can take a screenshot and we can preserve ourselves for posterity's sake. And have a good day.
And I would like to thank the organizers themselves. I mean, it has been such a pleasure. And as Shashikala pointed out, I mean, it's been years since, and the 3 organizers, Shinjini, Drupadi, and Shashikala from 3 different universities, having put it all together and made it possible for so many people to meet. It's been a fabulous conference, and thank you so much for providing us this opportunity.
I join him in that. And so good to see you guys again.
See you then.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Me too.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashikala. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Shall I take the screenshot? Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks to all the organizers.
Yeah, Shashi, take the shot.
I took
Take the shot, the final shot, yes.
Yes. All right. Okay. I'm going off. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye, everybody. Yeah.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Good night.
All right.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
TJ, we can't believe that you're retired soon.
Can't believe that?
You're retiring soon.
Oh, yes. I can't believe it either. But okay. It happens.
No, of course you won't retire. You just move, I think, from one designation to another now.
What is the other designation?